Hey guys! Tonight, we're going to dim the lanterns, pour a lukewarm cup of something vaguely medieval, and stroll through the shadowy streets of old London. Don't worry, you don't have to actually go outside. You can just lie there in bed, blankets tucked up, eyes half closed, while I do the wandering for you. Think of this as a guided sleep tour of a city that smelled like bad fish, horse droppings, and wood smoke. Which, honestly, is not too far off from some parts of London today. Now, London in the Middle Ages was not the glittering capital we picture now. Forget red buses and glass skyscrapers. Instead, imagine narrow, crooked alleys barely wide enough for two people to pass without rubbing shoulders. And not in a cute romantic way, but in the oh no, did that man just sneeze plague droplets on me way. Houses leaned over the street so far they practically kissed each other, and every open space was filled with livestock, vendors, and people who hadn't bathed in a while. Which was, most people. But when the sun went down, the whole place changed. And that's where the Nightwatch came in. These were the unsung, unpaid, usually quite unwilling guardians of the sleeping city. Their job? Walk around with a lantern, shout things into the darkness, and try to keep everyone from robbing, stabbing, or accidentally setting the whole city on fire. A noble task. Except, of course, it was usually performed by random householders who'd rather be in bed. You see, the medieval Nightwatch wasn't some elite group of professional guards. No, that would have made sense. Instead, every able-bodied man in a ward, or neighborhood, was expected to take turns patrolling at night. Think of it like jury duty, except instead of sitting in a courtroom pretending to listen, you had to trudge around damp streets at 2 in the morning, hoping you wouldn't step in something unspeakable. And yes, people tried to get out of it. Constantly. Because let's be real, if you were a wealthy merchant, the last thing you wanted was to spend your night holding a wooden rattle and shivering in the fog, when you could pay someone else to do it. So they did. Wealthier men often hired substitutes, usually poorer folks who were desperate enough to risk a few stabbings in exchange for coin. Now, what exactly did the Nightwatch do? Well, first of all, they carried lanterns. These weren't the kind of bright, reassuring lanterns you see in movies. More like a sad little flame inside a horn casing that smoked and sputtered if you looked at it funny. Still, it was better than stumbling around in complete darkness, which, given medieval London's potholes, open sores, and occasional dead animals, was a real hazard. Their second duty was shouting the hours. Yes, the medieval version of an alarm clock was a man wandering by your house yelling 2 o'clock and all's well. Except it often wasn't well. Fires were common, fights broke out, and thieves had a habit of testing just how awake the watchmen really were. But the tradition of shouting persisted, probably more to prove they were still awake themselves than to reassure anyone else. And let's pause here for a moment to appreciate how much shouting defined medieval city life. Bells rang constantly. Town criers bellowed out news. Vendors screamed about their eels or pies or whatever mystery meat they were hawking. And then, at night, the watchmen added their chorus. So really, if you lived in London back then, sleeping through noise was an essential survival skill. Think of it like living next to an airport, except the planes are yelling at you personally. But fire prevention, now that was serious business. London was basically a tinderbox. The houses were timber, the roofs thatched, and everyone had a fireplace or candles burning. One small spark and suddenly you've got an inferno racing through the city. So the Nightwatch had to keep their eyes open for any suspicious glows. If they saw smoke, they'd rattle their wooden clappers to alert people. Yes, clappers, basically 2 pieces of wood slapped together. Not exactly cutting-edge firefighting technology, but it was what they had. And if you're wondering, no, they did not carry water buckets or hoses. That would have been far too practical. The standard procedure was more along the lines of, yell loudly, wake up everyone nearby, and hope the neighbors formed a bucket line before the entire street burned down. Medieval London's official fire strategy could be summarized as, panic early, panic often. Now, the watch also had to deal with curfew. Yes, a literal curfew. The bells rang at 9 or 10, depending on the era, and after that you were supposed to stay indoors. Taverns had to close, markets packed up, and everyone was expected to go home. The idea was that nothing good happens after dark, which, to be fair, is mostly true in a city without streetlights. But naturally, People ignored this rule, especially students, drunkards, and anyone who thought sneaking out was more fun than sleeping. So the watch would sometimes stop late-night wanderers and ask them what they were doing. If you couldn't come up with a good excuse, you might be thrown in the local cage or the stocks until morning. Which sounds humiliating, but honestly, some people probably preferred sleeping it off outdoors rather than trudging home in the dark. Speaking of dark, let's talk about crime. London at night was not exactly safe. Pickpockets, burglars, and gangs roamed the streets, because of course they did. The watch was supposed to deter them, but remember, these were not trained fighters. If a group of thugs appeared, the average watchman's instinct was probably less heroic showdown and more suddenly fascinated by this interesting wall over here. Still, their mere presence sometimes kept trouble at bay. And we can't ignore the supernatural side of things. People in medieval London genuinely believed that ghosts, demons, and other creatures prowled at night. So part of the watch's role was almost symbolic, showing that the city wasn't abandoned to the dark. Imagine trying to patrol your neighborhood with only a lantern while half the town believes you might bump into a literal demon. I don't know about you, but I'd be rattling those clappers very loudly, just in case. Of course, the city authorities tried to regulate the watch with various ordinances. There were rules about how many men had to patrol, what equipment they carried, and how often they switched shifts. In practice, though, it was chaotic. Some nights, only a handful of men showed up. Other nights, they all got drunk together instead of patrolling. There are records of watchmen being fined for sleeping on duty, abandoning their post, or, my personal favorite, getting into fights with each other. Truly, the protectors of the night. Now, one detail that often gets overlooked is just how cold and miserable these patrols could be. London nights were damp, foggy, and bone-chilling, especially in winter. There were no thermal jackets or hot coffee to keep you going. Just a wool cloak, thin shoes, and maybe some ale if you were lucky. So it's not surprising that watchmen sometimes huddled together in doorways, trying not to freeze. Romantic in theory, miserable in practice. And yet, despite the flaws, the Nightwatch did matter. They were the backbone of what little security medieval London had. Without them, fires might rage unchecked, thieves would run wild, and the streets would be even more terrifying than they already were. It was far from a perfect system, but it kept the city functioning. As time went on, the Nightwatch evolved. By the 14th and 15th centuries, London experimented with hiring more permanent staff, men who actually did this regularly instead of reluctantly taking turns. Think of it as the earliest form of professional policing. But even then, they weren't exactly Scotland Yard material. More like your grumpy uncle with a lantern and a stick, told to make himself useful. And that's the thing, life in medieval London wasn't about perfection. It was about getting by with what you had. The Nightwatch didn't prevent every crime or every fire, but they gave people a sense that someone was out there, keeping an eye on things. Even if that someone was half asleep, muttering about how cold it was, and occasionally mistaking a cat for a burglar. So, if you're drifting off to sleep right now, maybe imagine yourself as a watchman on duty. You're trudging through the misty streets, clapper in hand, lantern swinging. You pass shuttered houses, hear a dog bark in the distance, maybe smell bread baking in a late-night oven. You mutter 2 o'clock and all's well, even though you're not entirely sure it is. And then you keep walking, because that's all you can do, just keep walking through the dark, until the sun comes up and someone else takes your place. So, let's drift away now from the damp cobblestones of medieval London nights, and into something a little warmer, a little more caffeinated, and a whole lot more talkative. Welcome to the coffeehouses of 17th and 18th century London, otherwise known as the places where Enlightenment men went to pretend they were cleverer than they actually were. Now, before you get too cozy with your modern latte in hand, remember, coffee in the 1600s was not the frothy, sugary dessert in a cup situation we call coffee today. There were no caramel drizzle macchiatos, no oat milk flat whites, no pumpkin spice anything. Coffee then was a strong, bitter, slightly burnt liquid poured from a questionable pot that had probably been used since Charles II was in diapers. People didn't sip it for taste. They drank it because it was new, it was exotic, and most importantly, it kept you awake long enough to argue with strangers about politics. London's first coffee house opened in the 1650s, and by the early 1700s, there were hundreds of them. Each one was crammed into a dim, smoky little room, smelling like a mix of ink, pipe tobacco, wet wool coats, and the aforementioned bitter brew. If you're picturing cozy cafes with rustic charm, don't. Imagine instead a crowded, noisy space where everyone talks at once, the tables are sticky, and the only available seat is next to some guy loudly reading a pamphlet he clearly wrote himself. And here's the best part. Admission was basically the price of 1 penny. For a single coin, you got entry into this chaotic intellectual playground. That's why they were sometimes called penny universities. A lovely marketing spin on what was essentially pay 1 penny to eavesdrop on men arguing about taxes until midnight. Who were these men, exactly? Well, pretty much anyone who could scrape together a penny and endure the bitterness of early modern coffee. Merchants, writers, lawyers, scientists, pamphleteers, gossipmongers, aspiring revolutionaries. Basically the kind of crowd that today would all be running anonymous Twitter accounts. The king hated them. Clergymen hated them. Wives especially hated them, because their husbands would disappear for hours and come back with nothing but political ranting and coffee breath. In fact, wives were so annoyed that in 1674, a satirical pamphlet appeared called the Women's Petition Against Coffee. It complained that men were spending too much time in coffeehouses, losing their vigor, and coming home weak and distracted. Which, of course, the men immediately responded to with their own pamphlet defending coffee. So yes, even in the 17th century, gender wars were fought via badly written think pieces. Inside, the atmosphere was both democratic and chaotic. Everyone sat at long communal tables, strangers and friends alike, and you could in theory talk to anyone. Rank and class blurred a little in here, which was shocking in a society obsessed with hierarchy. A nobleman might sit beside a merchant, a bookseller next to a lawyer. Everyone had the right to speak, though of course some people spoke more loudly and for much longer than anyone wanted them to. The conversations ranged from business deals to philosophy to, inevitably, conspiracy theories. Because what is a public gathering without someone whispering that the king is secretly in league with the French, or that papists are about to invade? In fact, the government was so alarmed by coffeehouse chatter that Charles II once tried to ban them entirely, declaring them hotbeds of sedition. This, naturally, backfired instantly. Londoners rioted at the thought of losing their coffee fix, and the ban was quietly dropped within days. You'd think Charles might have learned that banning caffeine never ends well. But coffeehouses weren't just gossip dens. They were also hubs of information. Newspapers were still new, expensive, and sometimes censored, but coffeehouses often kept a few copies lying around. People would read them aloud for the room, adding their own commentary, of course. Pamphlets circulated, news sheets, even handwritten newsletters. It was like the early internet, messy, unreliable, but thrilling. If you wanted to know what was happening in politics, trade, or scandal, you went to a coffeehouse. And much like the internet, each coffeehouse developed its own identity. Some specialized in trade and finance, attracting merchants and stock jobbers. Lloyd's Coffeehouse, for instance, became famous for shipping gossip, which eventually evolved into Lloyd's of London, the giant insurance market. Others catered to writers, scientists, or radicals. If you were into literature, you might haunt Will's Coffeehouse, where John Dryden held court. If you were into science, you might show up at a place where members of the Royal Society argued about whether blood circulates clockwise or counterclockwise, or whatever weird debate they were having that week. And of course, there were always political haunts. Whig coffeehouses, Tory coffeehouses, Jacobite coffeehouses, all filled with men muttering conspiracies, plotting pamphlets, and occasionally slipping information to spies. Because naturally, if you get a bunch of ambitious men together, someone's going to end up whispering treason. Now, let's talk about the actual coffee itself. It was served black, bitter, and usually lukewarm. Sugar was an expensive luxury, milk wasn't standard, and cream was even rarer. So really, you were just drinking hot bitterness in a mug, while pretending it gave you intellectual superpowers. And maybe it did, compared to the alternative. Before coffeehouses, most people drank ale or small beer all day, even at breakfast. So switching to coffee meant suddenly you had sober people talking late into the night, instead of drunk people falling asleep in puddles. Coffee fueled an entire shift in how Europeans thought, wrote, and argued. But with sobriety came something else: paranoia. Because if you get enough men sitting together in a smoky room, with too much caffeine and not enough daylight, they will inevitably convince themselves the government is hiding something. Some coffeehouses became known as breeding grounds for conspiracy theories. You could walk in for a quiet cup and leave convinced that the French were tunneling under the Channel or that Jesuits had infiltrated the postal service. It didn't help that coffeehouses were deeply male spaces. Women weren't banned outright, but they were rare inside, and when they did appear, it was usually as proprietors or servants. The whole scene was masculine, competitive, and a little performative. Everyone wanted to sound informed, witty, or radical, which meant constant one-upmanship. Think less relaxing cafe and more loud debate club fueled by too much caffeine. Perfect bedtime listening, I know. And while many people ranted and postured, a surprising amount of real business got done in coffeehouses. Stock deals, insurance contracts, even newspaper ventures started there. Editors picked up stories, printers found material, and rumors spread faster than wildfire. Honestly, if you think Twitter spreads nonsense quickly, imagine a crowded room of men all shouting rumors at once, with no way to fact-check anything. By the time you finished your cup, half the city believed the Queen was pregnant with twins or that the Dutch fleet was sailing up the Thames. Now, let's float gently into a smaller detail: the coffeehouse penny. That tiny coin didn't just buy you a drink. It bought you access to knowledge, to debate, to a kind of proto-democracy. In a world where universities were closed to most people and books were expensive, the coffeehouse gave ordinary men a chance to join the conversation. Not equally, of course. This was still a society where wealth and connections mattered, but it cracked the door open just enough for new voices to slip through. And it wasn't only London. Paris had its own coffeehouses, famously buzzing with philosophers, writers, and revolutionaries. Voltaire practically lived on coffee, allegedly drinking dozens of cups a day, which probably explains both his productivity and his general crankiness. In Vienna, coffeehouses became cultural institutions, with people lingering for hours over chess and newspapers. But London's coffeehouses had their own peculiar flavor: half gossip parlor, half business exchange, half political underground. Yes, that's three halves. Coffeehouses never did math very well. Let's not romanticize it too much, though. Coffeehouses were not always pleasant. They were crowded, smelly, and noisy. The smoke was thick, the floors sticky, and fights broke out regularly. Some became notorious for pickpockets or unsavory characters. And yes, there were always those self-appointed intellectuals who never stopped talking. You know the type. The guy who's read half a pamphlet and now wants to explain the entire state of European politics to you, whether you asked or not. Coffeehouses were full of them. Still, in their own chaotic way, they helped shape the Enlightenment. They created a space where ideas, good, bad, half-baked, could be shared. They made information more accessible. They encouraged debate, satire, pamphleteering, and all the messy chatter that eventually fueled revolutions. And they gave us the delightful historical image of wig-wearing men sipping bitter sludge while shouting at each other until dawn. So, if you're cozy in bed right now, maybe picture yourself sitting in a smoky 18th century coffeehouse. The tables are scratched and stained, the room smells of tobacco and damp wool, and the coffee in your cup is frankly terrible. But around you, men are arguing passionately, about trade, about politics, about whether Newton or Leibniz invented calculus first. And even if half of it is nonsense, you can't help but feel that something important is happening. Ideas are spreading, connections forming, history quietly brewing in the background. All for the price of a single penny. So, we've wandered through the foggy nights of medieval London, we've sat in the smoky chaos of Enlightenment coffeehouses, and now it's time to chew on something stranger. Literally. Tonight, let's talk about a form of medieval justice that involved bread, cheese, and the deeply questionable idea that God was moonlighting as a throat inspector. Yes, we're diving into the bizarre world of the ordeal of cheese and cake. Because why rely on evidence, testimony, or anything resembling common sense, when you could just feed a suspect some food and see what happened? Welcome to medieval Europe. Now, trials in the Middle Ages weren't always the solemn courtroom dramas we imagine today. Sure, there were laws, charters, and judges in flowing robes. But when things got tricky, Like when no one could agree who was guilty, people often turned to ordeals. These were tests meant to let God decide. Because apparently, the Almighty had nothing better to do than referee minor disputes about stolen goats or slandered neighbors. Some ordeals were dramatic. You might be told to plunge your hand into boiling water and see if it healed cleanly. Or walk across hot irons without burning your feet. Or, my personal favorite, be thrown into a river. If you floated, you were guilty. If you sank, you were innocent, but also possibly drowned. Justice was not exactly user-friendly. And then there was the culinary option, the ordeal of the morsel, sometimes called ordeal by consecrated bread and cheese. The premise was simple. You gave the accused a piece of bread and cheese that had been blessed by a priest. If they could swallow it smoothly, they were innocent. If they choked, coughed, or sputtered, it meant God had revealed their guilt. Congratulations. You just got convicted by dairy products. Let's pause here. Imagine being accused of theft in your small medieval village. Everyone gathers in the church. The priest solemnly blesses a chunk of bread and a wedge of cheese. You're told to eat. The crowd stares. Your throat is dry from nerves, your hands are shaking, and suddenly that bite feels like sawdust. You cough once, and boom, you're guilty. Case closed. Honestly, medieval justice makes Twitter cancel culture look merciful. The origins of this ordeal go back to ancient ideas about oaths and sacred food. The thinking was, if you swore innocence before God and then ate holy bread and cheese, the truth would reveal itself physically. Guilt, apparently, caused instant indigestion. To modern ears, it sounds absurd, but in a deeply religious society, the logic had weight. People genuinely believed God could and would use their body as a courtroom. And it wasn't just for petty theft. In some records, the ordeal of bread and cheese was used for serious accusations. Sorcery, heresy, even treason. Because nothing says high stakes like nibbling nervously on a slice of cheddar while your entire future hangs in the balance. The cheese wasn't always just ordinary cheese, either. Some accounts mention exomologesis, a ritual where the bread and cheese were consecrated at the altar and treated almost like the Eucharist. Which meant refusing the ordeal was suspicious too. If you said, "No thanks, I'm lactose intolerant," people didn't nod sympathetically. They thought, yes, clearly guilty. You couldn't win. There's also the issue of choking. Let's be honest, medieval food safety wasn't stellar. Bread was dense, cheese was hard, and nobody had a glass of water ready on the side. Add in a crowd staring at you, the anxiety of potential execution, and a dry throat. Yeah, lots of innocent people probably choked. Meanwhile, some smug thief with a strong gullet breezed through. Justice served, medieval style. One particularly amusing thing is how often the ordeal was mocked by later commentators. Even medieval writers themselves sometimes rolled their eyes at the idea that God had a vested interest in bread-based trials. Legal reforms in the 13th century gradually phased out ordeals, especially after the church officially withdrew its blessing from the practice. Apparently, even the priests got tired of playing gastro-judge. But before we leave the cheese ordeal behind, let's savor the atmosphere. Picture it, a small stone church, smoky from incense. Villagers packed shoulder to shoulder, eager for a bit of drama in their otherwise uneventful week. The accused, pale and sweating, stands before the priest. The morsel is blessed, placed reverently in trembling hands. Everyone leans in. A bite is taken. Silence. A cough. Gasps ripple through the crowd. Justice has spoken. Or at least, indigestion has. And here's a fun twist. It wasn't always bread and cheese. Some versions mention bread and cheesecake, which sounds almost pleasant until you realize it was probably just a heavy lump of baked dough with cheese mixed in. Not exactly a birthday treat. The word cake here doesn't mean fluffy sponge. It means dense, chewy, choke-worthy loaf. Perfect for high-stakes courtroom drama. What's fascinating is how this ordeal reflects the medieval obsession with blending the sacred and the mundane. Food wasn't just food. It was a channel for divine judgment. Eating became a test of faith, a ritual of truth. We moderns rely on fingerprints, DNA, CCTV footage. They relied on whether you could swallow without coughing. Different times. And of course, there's the darker side. Imagine how easy it was to rig this ordeal. A priest could bless the food with a particularly stern prayer. A village rival could slip in some dry crumbs or even a bit of ash. Or the accused might just be so terrified they couldn't swallow. In other words, it wasn't justice, it was theater. Theater that decided lives. Still, ordeals like this remind us how much communities craved certainty. In a world without forensic science, without reliable records, people wanted a clear sign. And if that sign came in the form of cheese, well, better than endless disputes. At least everyone could nod and say, well, God has spoken. Even if secretly, half of them thought it was nonsense. The ordeal of cheese and cake faded out by the later Middle Ages, swept aside by more rational legal procedures. But its memory lingered in satire and folklore. Jokes about choking on holy bread popped up for centuries. Even today, the phrase feels surreal, like something Monty Python would invent, except it actually happened. So if you're lying in bed, drifting between wake and sleep, maybe picture yourself in that medieval church. You're handed a dense morsel of bread and cheese. The crowd waits. You chew, swallow carefully, and you pass. Relief floods you. For tonight, at least, your throat and your innocence remain intact. And if you doze off before the end of this story, don't worry. All's well. You've survived the medieval justice system, at least in your dreams. So, we've walked the damp alleys with London's Nightwatch, we've sipped bitter coffee with Enlightenment gossips, we've nervously chewed through cheese-based justice, and now, we arrive at something so bizarre that it almost sounds made up. A pope on trial. Not just any pope. A dead pope. Yes, welcome to the late 9th century, and the deeply surreal fiasco known as the Cadaver Synod. Now, if you've ever thought modern politics is a circus, just be grateful you weren't alive in medieval Rome. Because back then, politics wasn't just dirty, it was occasionally dug up from the grave dirty. And the Catholic Church, which you might imagine as all incense and solemn hymns, was often knee-deep in backstabbing, scheming, and family feuds that would make Game of Thrones look restrained. Our story centers on Pope Formosus. His name alone is fun to say, like some sort of pasta dish. Formosus had been pope from 891 to 896, which doesn't sound like a long time, but in papal years, it was an eternity. These were turbulent decades when popes came and went faster than new iPhone models. Formosus managed to survive in the papal chair for 5 whole years, which was practically a Guinness World Record. But here's the problem, he wasn't very popular with everyone. Shocking, I know. He had made enemies, particularly with a powerful Roman faction aligned with the Spoleto family, local aristocrats who had the bad habit of thinking they owned the papacy. Formosus had supported their rivals, which meant that after his death in 896, they weren't about to let him rest in peace. Literally. Enter Pope Stephen VI, the unlucky man who inherited both the papal throne and the simmering grudges. Stephen wasn't exactly the brightest candle on the altar. He was, however, ambitious enough, or desperate enough, to side with the Spoltans. And they had an idea. A terrible, terrible idea. What if, they whispered, we put the late Pope Formosus on trial? Now, a sensible person might have said, that's insane. He's dead. But medieval Rome was not a place where sense thrived. Instead, Stephen agreed. Thus was born the Cadaver Synod of 897, one of the most macabre farces in church history. Picture it, St. John Lateran Basilica in Rome, the Grand Cathedral. Bishops gather, murmuring nervously. Pope Stephen presides, looking tense. And in the middle of it all, seated on a throne, dressed in papal robes, is the decomposing corpse of Formosus. They had dug him up, propped him upright, and even given him the papal staff to hold. Because apparently, if you're going to put a corpse on trial, you might as well dress him for the occasion. One can only imagine the smell. Rome was hot. Embalming was rudimentary. And this was a body that had been in the ground for months. So while the official record says the trial began, the unrecorded truth is probably that half the court was trying not to gag. Still, they pressed on. Since Formosus was not in a position to defend himself, they appointed a deacon to speak on his behalf. Imagine being that poor man. Your job is to stand next to a rotting pope and pretend to represent his legal defense. Not exactly the dream assignment. The charges were read: perjury, ambition, coveting the papacy illegally, breaking canon law by moving from one bishopric to another. Basically, they accused him of being shifty, power-hungry, and disobedient. Which, to be fair, described about 90% of medieval clergy. But Formosus was the unlucky scapegoat. Stephen ranted at the corpse, pointing his finger dramatically, as if expecting a rebuttal. The deacon mumbled half-hearted defenses. The bishops, intimidated and probably nauseated, nodded along. The outcome was, of course, predetermined. The dead man was found guilty. And the punishment? Stripping Formosus of all papal dignity. His corpse was torn out of its robes, the 3 fingers he had used for blessings were cut off, and his body was declared unfit for Christian burial. Then they tossed him into the Tiber River. A rather undignified ending for a pope. Though, one imagines, he wasn't too fussed about it at that point. The Cadaver Synod is one of those moments in history where you just have to pause and say, really? This was the best use of everyone's time? But it tells us a lot about the chaos of the era. The papacy wasn't the serene, untouchable office we often imagine. It was entangled in local politics, noble rivalries, and sheer pettiness. If a family wanted revenge, they'd dig up a pope and humiliate him publicly. That was the level of spite we're dealing with. And here's the kicker, the whole thing backfired. People were horrified. Even in a society accustomed to violence and spectacle, this was a step too far. The sight of a pope's corpse being desecrated in front of the clergy shocked Romans. Stephen VI's reputation plummeted. Within a year, he was deposed, imprisoned, and eventually strangled in his cell. Divine justice, perhaps, or just karmic irony. Meanwhile, Formosus's body didn't stay in the Tiber. It was later recovered by sympathetic monks, reburied with respect, and eventually even re-honored by later popes. The Cadaver Synod was officially denounced as a grotesque mistake, though it remained the kind of mistake people whispered about for centuries. If you zoom out, the Cadaver Synod is a perfect microcosm of medieval power struggles. It wasn't about theology. It wasn't about truth. It was about rival factions trying to assert dominance, even if it meant making a literal corpse the centerpiece of their argument. Politics reduced to theater. And in a strange way, it's also a reminder of how medieval people blurred the line between the living and the dead. Corpses weren't just remains, they carried symbolic weight. A dead pope could still be tried, condemned, stripped of power, because his body represented authority. As long as he existed, even in death, his enemies felt threatened. Now, I don't know about you, but imagining this entire scene, the corpse on the throne, the pope yelling at him, the bishops nervously nodding, is both absurd and oddly sleep-inducing. Like some grotesque puppet show where everyone takes it far too seriously. So, as you drift further into the pillows, maybe picture that surreal courtroom. Candles flicker. Bishops whisper. The air is heavy with incense and, unfortunately, decomposition. And at the center sits poor Formosus, silent, unblinking, and, if corpses could roll their eyes, probably wondering what on earth these people thought they were doing. In the end, history moves on. The Cadaver Synod faded into legend, an embarrassing footnote in church chronicles. But it lingers as one of those delightful reminders that the past wasn't just grand and solemn. It was messy, weird, and sometimes downright absurd. Which, honestly, makes it feel a lot more human. And with that, we'll gently close the coffin lid on this strange little episode. Rest well, Formosus. You've done more for bedtime history than you ever did in life. So, we've finished our stroll with Watchmen, we've drained our bitter penny coffee, we've swallowed our blessed cheese, and we've watched a pope's corpse get dragged through court. Which, let's be honest, is already quite a lot for one bedtime session. But before you drift off entirely, let's slide into one more theme that always gets whispered about in history corners: royal inbreeding. Yes. Tonight's lullaby is the saga of Europe's most genetically confused monarchs. Because nothing says sleep well like imagining kings and queens who married their cousins so often that family trees eventually looked more like tangled phone cords. Now, here's the thing. Royals were obsessed with keeping it in the family. And not in a creepy soap opera way, but in a political way. Marrying your cousin meant your lands stayed united. Your titles didn't leak out to rival families. And you didn't have to bother negotiating with strangers, which, to medieval nobles, sounded like far too much work. The result? Centuries of dynasties that basically treated Europe like one giant family reunion where everyone kept sneaking off to marry their first cousin. The most infamous example, of course, is the Habsburgs. Ah yes, the proud rulers of Spain, Austria, and half of Europe at one point. Their family motto might as well have been, "Why shop for spouses when you've already got a cousin at home?" Over generations, they married each other so frequently that by the 17th century, the results were noticeable. Enter Charles II of Spain, sometimes nicknamed the Bewitched. Charles was the unfortunate product of roughly 200 years of cousin-on-cousin matrimony. His family tree had fewer branches than a broomstick. He had the classic Habsburg jaw, so pronounced it looked like you could shelve books on it. He struggled with speech, drooled constantly, and was said to be barely able to chew food. Doctors at the time described him as unable to eat or walk properly, which is not exactly the kind of Yelp review you want as a king. Charles was also chronically sick, epileptic, and, not surprisingly, infertile. His poor wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, once complained that he spent their wedding night staring blankly and muttering prayers instead of, well, you know. The man was 20 years old, but physically resembled someone far older, and mentally was often described as childlike. Spain's entire empire rested on him producing an heir. Spoiler, he did not. The dynasty collapsed. All because the Habsburgs thought it was more important to keep their bloodlines pure than, functioning. But Charles wasn't the only one. Let's float back a little to the English Plantagenets, who had their own cousin-marrying habits. The royal houses of Lancaster and York intermarried so much during the late Middle Ages that by the time the Wars of the Roses broke out, most claimants to the throne were all cousins anyway. The whole Civil War was basically one extended family argument that got a little too stabby. Then there's the Ptolemies of Egypt. Yes, Cleopatra's family. These were Greek-descended monarchs ruling Egypt after Alexander the Great, and they took sibling marriage to a whole new level. Cleopatra herself was the product of several generations of brother-sister unions. In her family, the words royal wedding and awkward family dinner were basically the same thing. To them, it wasn't taboo, it was tradition. Egyptian pharaohs had married siblings for centuries to preserve divine bloodlines, and the Ptolemies just ran with it. Of course, the downside of centuries of inbreeding is fairly obvious. Health issues, strange physical traits, infertility, and occasional bouts of mental instability, which, when you're ruling empires, is not ideal. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing your king can't walk straight, your queen is both his niece and his cousin, and the heir is currently drooling into his ceremonial robes. Sleep tight. Subjects. But perhaps the saddest part of this royal inbreeding saga is how deliberate it was. They genuinely believed they were preserving purity, when in fact they were slowly reducing their dynasties into fragile glass figurines. Beautiful, yes, but brittle, breakable, and often cracked beyond repair. Let's take another quiet example. Joanna of Castile, better known as Joanna the Mad. Now, to be fair, historians debate whether Joanna was truly mentally unstable or just politically sidelined by men around her. But the fact remains, her family was the Habsburg dynasty, her husband was Philip the Handsome, handsome by medieval standards, which often meant his hair and teeth, and her children included Charles V, yet another Habsburg who juggled empires and jaw deformities at the same time. Joanna herself was deeply in love with Philip, to the point of obsession. When he died young, she reportedly traveled with his embalmed body, refusing to bury him, convinced he might rise again. Some call that devotion. Others call it a breakdown. Either way, it didn't help the dynasty's reputation for instability. And yes, inbreeding probably didn't help with the emotional fragility running through that family. What makes all of this so soothingly absurd, when you tell it at bedtime, is how normal it seemed at the time. To us, it's bizarre. To them, it was strategy. Cousins married cousins, siblings wed siblings, and entire empires were built on the idea that you didn't want to dilute your bloodline with anyone too exotic. Ironically, their obsession with purity often led to dynastic extinction. So, if you're lying there in bed right now, cozy and drifting, maybe imagine a medieval royal family tree. The branches don't spread outward. They curl inward, looping back on themselves like a poorly drawn spiral. Faces repeat. Names repeat. And somewhere at the bottom sits poor Charles II of Spain, drooling onto his throne, struggling to chew his dinner, while courtiers pretend everything is perfectly fine. Because, after all, he was God's chosen king. Sure, if God had a dark sense of humor. In the end, royal inbreeding stands as one of those historical lessons humanity quietly absorbed. Maybe, just maybe, you shouldn't marry your first cousin 6 generations in a row. But for centuries, Europe's monarchies did exactly that, leaving us with some of the strangest, saddest, and most oddly fascinating rulers in history. And as a bedtime story, it works surprisingly well. Because if you can picture a court full of fragile royals with oversized jaws and delicate health, it's hard not to feel a little more grateful for your own ordinary, unroyal, non-inbred family tree. So far tonight we've followed lantern-carrying watchmen, bickering coffee drinkers, nervous cheese eaters, a dead pope on trial, and the most inbred monarchs Europe had to offer. At this point, you might be wondering, what about the kids? Because behind every drooling, jaw-heavy Habsburg or scheming Plantagenet, there were royal children being raised with all the tender warmth and stability of a cold stone castle. Let's be honest, medieval royal childhood was less about toys and bedtime stories and more about survival, politics, and occasionally, tuberculosis. Most royal children were either sickly little bundles of dynastic hope, or spoiled brats raised on the delusion that the world revolved around them. And sometimes, they managed to be both at once. Take, for example, the young princes of England. Being born into the Plantagenet or Tudor household might sound glamorous, but in reality, it was terrifying. Infant mortality was high. Even kings and queens buried children constantly. Henry VIII, for instance, famously obsessed over producing a healthy son because so many of his earlier children died. His daughter Mary was sickly and often treated like fragile glass. His beloved son Edward VI actually made it to the throne, only to die at age 15, leaving England scrambling. Being a royal child meant being the center of everyone's plans, and yet at constant risk of not living long enough to carry them out. And when they did survive, well, they were often spoiled in ways that made them completely unfit for real life. Imagine being a 5-year-old prince in a castle where grown men bow to you, tutors fawn over your genius because you managed to spell your name, and servants rush to bring you candied almonds whenever you pout. By the time you're 12, you genuinely believe you're God's gift to humanity. Which, to be fair, is exactly what everyone tells you. Until, of course, you inherit the throne and promptly run your kingdom into the ground. The Habsburg children are another tragic case. Remember Charles II of Spain from last part? His childhood was essentially one long medical file. He was breastfed until the age of 4 because his jaw wouldn't let him chew properly. Tutors described him as weak in body and spirit, which is a polite way of saying he was more interested in staring into space than learning Latin. His childhood wasn't filled with playtime or carefree days. It was doctors, priests, and endless prayers that he might someday, somehow, produce an heir. Spoiler, he did not. But not all royal children were sickly. Some were spoiled to the point of absurdity. French princes in the 17th century were so indulged that courtiers treated even their tantrums as charming. One ambassador described young Louis XIV as being fed pastries whenever he cried, which might explain why he grew up into a king who thought building Versailles during an economic crisis was a totally reasonable idea. And then there were the unlucky spares. You've probably heard the phrase, the heir and the spare. Royal families loved having backups, just in case the firstborn died of plague, or fell off a horse, or was poisoned at dinner. But the spare rarely had a happy life. They were raised in the shadow of the heir, important enough to be watched closely, but not important enough to matter in the long run. Some grew bitter. Others rebelled. Many just wasted away, trapped in castles where every move was dictated by politics. For example, poor Richard of Shrewsbury, one of the princes in the Tower. He was the younger brother, the spare. He and his brother Edward were locked in the Tower of London, supposedly for their protection, but of course, they never came out. Their disappearance remains one of history's great mysteries, but it's a perfect reminder that royal childhood could end abruptly and tragically, especially if you were inconvenient to someone's claim to the throne. And what about education? You might imagine royal children being rigorously tutored, groomed for greatness. Sometimes, yes, they studied Latin, rhetoric, theology, maybe a bit of law. But often it was more about appearances than substance. They were told what to say, how to act, and how to bow in just the right way. Real curiosity was not encouraged. Nobody wanted a prince asking too many questions. After all, critical thinking was dangerous when your entire authority rested on divine right. Of course, childhood illnesses loomed over everything. Royal nurseries were breeding grounds for measles, smallpox, and whooping cough. Some children survived with scars. Others didn't. Entire dynasties shifted because a single royal toddler failed to make it past their third birthday. We think of medieval and early modern monarchs as mighty figures, but in reality, their fates often hinged on the fragile lungs of a wheezing child. And then there's the strangest part. Many royal children weren't even raised by their parents. They were handed over to nurses, governesses, or entire households of servants. Kings and queens might see their kids occasionally, like exotic visitors passing through. Imagine growing up knowing your mother is a queen, but she only visits once a month, and when she does, it's to scold you for not standing up straight. Emotional intimacy wasn't exactly in fashion. Some, of course, turned out fine, or at least functional. Elizabeth I was a royal child who endured neglect, scandal, and constant threats, yet grew into one of England's greatest monarchs. But she was the exception, not the rule. For every Elizabeth, there were dozens of frail Edwards, fragile Joannas, or confused Charleses stumbling their way through adulthood. So what do we make of royal childhood? On the surface, it looks gilded: castles, servants, fine clothes. But under the surface, it was lonely, fragile, and full of pressure. The children of kings and queens weren't playing with wooden toys in the mud. They were political pawns, their very existence tied to alliances and wars. And often, they paid for it with their health, their happiness, or their sanity. If you're lying in bed right now, imagine yourself as one of those royal children. You're in a drafty stone chamber, bundled in too many layers, listening to the distant toll of bells. Servants tiptoe around you, whispering about your health. Your tutor drones on about Latin declensions. And somewhere, your parents are busy scheming about your marriage to some cousin in another kingdom. You're not really a child. You're a bargaining chip, a name on a treaty, a fragile body carrying the hopes of a dynasty. And as you drift off, you might think, maybe being a peasant kid, running around barefoot in the mud, wasn't so bad after all. At least you got to be a child, instead of a future headline in the annals of dynastic tragedy. So far, we've seen night watchmen stumble through London fog, jittery men in coffeehouses invent conspiracy theories, terrified villagers choke on blessed cheese, a dead pope dragged into court, royals who married their cousins one too many times, and children born into palaces that felt more like gilded prisons. At this point, you might be wondering, could it get any worse? Oh, yes, it could. Because now we arrive at the grand finale, a few of the most dysfunctional kings and queens in history. Rulers so spectacularly bad at their jobs, or so utterly eccentric, that they make even modern politicians look like stable geniuses. Let's begin with Charles VI of France, known affectionately, or not so affectionately, as Charles the Mad. He reigned in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, a period already riddled with war and plague, so France really didn't need extra problems. Unfortunately, Charles provided plenty. At first, he seemed promising. Young, energetic, and eager to rule. But then the cracks began to show. Charles suffered from psychotic episodes, during which he believed bizarre things, most famously, that he was made of glass. Yes, glass. He wore reinforced clothing to prevent himself from shattering, refused to be touched, and sat very carefully to avoid breaking. Imagine being a courtier trying to bow respectfully while your king whispers, "Don't come too close, or I might crack." Awkward. Sometimes, Charles forgot who he was altogether. He once ran screaming through the forest, attacking his own men in a frenzy. Another time, he insisted he wasn't the king at all, just a poor peasant. Which honestly might have been the most accurate thing he ever said. His reign was so chaotic that France spiraled deeper into the 100 Years' War, and his bouts of madness left the government in the hands of squabbling nobles. Dysfunctional? Definitely. Sleep-inducing? Absolutely. Now, drifting eastward, let's meet Ivan IV of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible. And yes, he earned that nickname. Ivan started out okay, instituting reforms, strengthening the state, and building cathedrals like St. Basil's in Moscow. But then he slid into paranoia, violence, and fits of rage. He created the Oprichnina, a secret police force that terrorized anyone he suspected of treason. Spoiler, that was almost everyone. He was notorious for outbursts. Once, during an argument, he struck his own son in the head with a staff, killing him. Which is not the best fatherly behavior. Russia under Ivan became a place of fear, executions, and instability, all while the Tsar himself swung wildly between bouts of religious devotion and violent tantrums. Imagine trying to fall asleep at night in 16th century Moscow, knowing your ruler might wake up tomorrow and decide to burn down half the city. Cozy dreams. But dysfunction didn't always mean violence. Sometimes it just meant being spectacularly unfit for the throne. Take Queen Joanna of Naples in the 14th century. She was accused, perhaps unfairly, perhaps not, of arranging the murder of her first husband, then went on to marry 3 more times, each match more scandalous than the last. Her reign was marked by intrigue, lawsuits, invasions, and a general sense of soap opera drama. She ruled for decades, but her personal life kept the rumor mill turning non-stop. Or look at Christian VII of Denmark in the 18th century. Christian was troubled. He became king as a teenager and quickly gained a reputation for bizarre behavior. He slapped people randomly, laughed at funerals, and engaged in endless practical jokes that no one found funny. He was also obsessed with certain, shall we say, solitary habits, which he indulged in excessively, worrying the court doctors. Real governance? Not so much. His reign might have been a total disaster if not for his physician, Johan Struensee, who basically took over running Denmark behind the scenes. Struensee implemented reforms, and also started an affair with the Queen, which, shockingly, ended badly. The scandal resulted in Struensee's execution, the Queen's exile, and Christian being left to, well, keep being dysfunctional. And finally, let's float gently to Spain again, where dysfunction practically became a family heirloom. Philip V of Spain, the first Bourbon king, was prone to depression and breakdowns. He sometimes refused to change his clothes for weeks, insisted on strange rituals, and preferred hunting to ruling. Later in life, he grew so withdrawn that his second wife basically governed for him. Not exactly the image of regal strength. What all these rulers have in common is that their personal struggles became national problems. In a modern democracy, a dysfunctional leader might get voted out, impeached, or at least yelled at on social media. But in a monarchy, you were stuck with them until death. If your king thought he was made of glass, well, guess what? So did your entire government. So, as you sink deeper into your pillows, picture these dysfunctional monarchs. Charles VI, carefully avoiding sudden movements so he wouldn't shatter. Ivan the Terrible, glaring suspiciously at everyone in sight. Christian VII, laughing inappropriately at solemn occasions. Philip V, refusing to get dressed while Spain muddled along without him. They were kings and queens, yes, but also fragile, flawed, deeply human people. And that, oddly enough, is what makes them soothing bedtime company. Because while their reigns were disasters, their stories remind us that history isn't just about battles and treaties. It's also about people, strange, broken, dysfunctional people, stumbling through power the same way the rest of us stumble through life. So if you're still awake, and let's be honest, you might not be, let this final image lull you, a royal throne, gilded and ornate, occupied not by a great statesman or a fierce warrior, but by someone convinced they're made of glass, or someone too lazy to change their socks, or someone marrying their cousin for the 4th time. History is full of dysfunction. Okay. We begin with something a little lighter than plague-ridden monarchs or another round of cousins marrying cousins. Instead, we're going to step into the warm, smoky glow of the 18th century coffeehouse. So, go ahead and get comfortable. Put on your comfiest socks. Pour yourself a cup of chamomile, or if you want to be historically accurate, maybe brew up some pitch-black, suspiciously bitter coffee. Just make sure you don't start plotting a revolution halfway through, because that's exactly what everyone else seemed to be doing. Now, The Enlightenment is one of those words you hear thrown around in history classes. Age of reason. Age of progress. A time when powdered wigs apparently contained more wisdom than lice, and when gentlemen and sometimes daring ladies claimed to solve the mysteries of the universe between bouts of gout. But here's the thing. So many of the so-called great ideas of the 18th century, the theories, the revolutions, the wild new financial schemes, weren't whispered in the marble halls of palaces. They were muttered over mugs of coffee in tiny, cramped rooms that smelled like roasted beans, unwashed coats, and political paranoia. Because the coffee house wasn't just a place to caffeinate. It was the Enlightenment's version of Reddit. Only instead of trolls typing furiously from their basements, you had wigged men leaning across sticky oak tables, loudly declaring that the king was an idiot, or that investing in the South Sea Company was definitely not going to go wrong. Spoiler: it did. So tonight, we're going to float through that world. We'll wander into some of the most famous coffee houses, meet the conspirators and eccentrics who haunted them, and take a gentle stroll through the endless paranoia of governments that hated the fact their citizens were gathering in public and talking. Imagine the horror. Let's start with London. Because if you're going to picture a coffee house in the early 18th century, London is the perfect backdrop. The streets were muddy, the Thames smelled like death, and every alley was filled with vendors shouting at you to buy suspiciously grey oysters. Amid all that, you had these new, exotic shops popping up, coffee houses. The first arrived in the mid-1600s, and people didn't quite know what to make of them. The drink itself was described as everything from a miracle cure to a devil's brew. Some pamphlets claimed coffee would sober you up from alcohol and sharpen your mind. Others insisted it would shrivel your reproductive organs. Always comforting. But regardless of medical warnings, Londoners piled in. By 1700, there were hundreds of coffee houses, each with its own crowd and reputation. If you were into science, you went to the Grecian. If you wanted to gamble and gossip, you headed to White's. If you wanted the freshest political rumors, you could basically pick any of them, since slandering Parliament over a mug of coffee was practically a national pastime. The setup was simple, a penny for a cup, and you could sit all day. That's why they were sometimes called penny universities. Because for the price of a coin, you had access to lectures, debates, gossip, pamphlets, and the occasional rant from a man who really should have been cut off after his third refill. And this terrified the authorities. Imagine being a monarch used to having priests and courtiers carefully curate what your subjects think. Then suddenly, there's a smoky little room where merchants, lawyers, sailors, and even a few scrappy writers are openly debating whether you're fit to rule. Not exactly a king's dream scenario. In fact, Charles II tried to ban them in 1675. His official proclamation claimed coffee houses were seminaries of sedition, which is a fancy way of saying, these people keep making fun of me, and I hate it. The ban lasted about 2 weeks. The backlash was so immediate, so furious, that Charles backed down, probably muttering into his wine goblet about how unfair it was to be king when everyone's so mean. Let's drift inside one of these places. The room is dim, lit by tallow candles that drip wax everywhere. The air is thick with smoke, pipe smoke, not cigarette smoke, since those hadn't yet conquered Europe. The tables are sticky, the benches are hard, and everyone is talking at once. You hear one man declare that Newton has finally cracked the secrets of the cosmos. At another table, a group of merchants are loudly arguing about East India Company shares. And in the corner, a pamphleteer is scribbling furiously, ready to publish tomorrow's rant about how the government is corrupt. Which, to be fair, it was. Coffee houses weren't just about politics. They were also proto-newsrooms. Newspapers in the 18th century weren't the slick, daily operations we imagine today. They were scrappy, often partisan, and sometimes printed from the backrooms of these very same coffee houses. Newsletters would circulate around the tables, covered in greasy fingerprints, while men shouted about whether the War of Spanish Succession was going well or not. Spoiler: usually not. And because literacy rates were climbing, especially in cities, this meant information spread like wildfire. Some of it accurate, much of it completely invented. If Twitter has taught us anything, it's that humans never needed the internet to spread fake news. They were already excellent at it by 1710. Now, let's float over to Paris. Because if Londoners used coffeehouses as rumour mills, the French managed to turn them into full-blown revolutionary incubators. Paris got its first coffeehouse in the 1670s, and by the mid-18th century, they were thriving. Voltaire was basically fueled by caffeine, drinking what some estimates put it up to 50 cups a day. Though to be fair, his cups were closer to shots, since he preferred small servings laced with chocolate. Very chic. The Café Procope was the most famous haunt. It attracted everyone from philosophers to revolutionaries to Benjamin Franklin, who somehow managed to make himself at home in Paris despite being a walking caricature of a disheveled uncle. Diderot, Rousseau, and later Robespierre all spent time at the Procope, scribbling notes that would one day fuel revolutions and terrifying committees. The French authorities, of course, hated this. But by the late 18th century, there was little they could do. Paris coffeehouses were too entrenched, too fashionable, and too full of armed, caffeine-drunk Jacobins. By the time the revolution rolled around, coffeehouses were basically unofficial headquarters for insurrection, which is sort of like imagining your local Starbucks being the launchpad for storming the Bastille. But back to conspiracies. Because while revolutions are the big-ticket story, the day-to-day paranoia was often much sillier. In both London and Paris, rumours swirled constantly that coffeehouses were the breeding grounds for plots. Government spies lurked in corners, pretending to read pamphlets while desperately eavesdropping. Sometimes they caught real conspiracies, assassination plots, smuggling rings, you name it. More often, they just ended up with long reports about men loudly insisting that the Duke of Marlborough was cheating at cards. One of my favourite minor scandals is the fear that women might actually start going to coffeehouses. Shocking, I know. In London, there was even a satirical pamphlet called the Women's Petition Against Coffee in 1674. It wasn't really written by women, it was a parody, but it claimed that coffee made men impotent and ruined their virility. The idea was that men were spending too much time gossiping in coffeehouses and not enough time, well, being husbands. The pamphlet went on about how coffee made men as unfruitful as the deserts whence that unhappy berry is said to be brought. Which is both hilarious and a reminder that even in satire, people were already making fun of coffee addicts. Let's pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Maybe sip your own tea or coffee, depending on the hour. We've been wandering through smoky rooms, brushing shoulders with Enlightenment philosophers and petty gossips alike. And we've only scratched the surface. Because in the next stretch, we're going to slide deeper into the actual conspiracies that brood over these mugs. We'll look at how stock market bubbles inflated inside coffeehouses. We'll meet the writers who launched careers out of caffeinated rants. And yes, we'll even spend time with the suspicious monarchs who tried, and failed, to shut the whole thing down. So stay cozy, because this ride is just beginning. Alright, so we've set the scene. You've got the smoky coffeehouses of London, the fashionable cafes of Paris, and a whole lot of very caffeinated chatter. Now let's float deeper into what exactly people were doing inside these places, beyond loudly accusing one another of being wrong about the 30 Years' War. Because coffeehouses weren't just social hangouts. They became the unofficial stock exchanges, newsrooms, lecture halls, rumour factories, and therapy groups of the 18th century. And in true Enlightenment fashion, they managed to combine intellectual debate with spectacular financial disasters. Let's begin with the South Sea bubble. If you've never heard of it, don't worry, half the people who invested in it had no idea what it was either, which is pretty standard when it comes to bubbles. The South Sea Company was founded in 1711, with the glamorous promise of trading in South America. Britain was at war with Spain at the time, and Spain kind of owned South America. So the company's business plan was essentially, someday, maybe, we'll convince Spain to let us trade there. In the meantime, the government used the company as a dumping ground for national debt. Investors piled in, imagining gold and silver pouring across the Atlantic. Where did much of this speculation take place? You guessed it. Coffee houses. Exchange Alley in London became a hotbed of stock jobbers, basically 18th century day traders in wigs. They crowded into Jonathan's Coffee House, Garraway's, and a few others, shouting buy and sell orders over the smell of burnt beans and pipe smoke. It was chaos. Pamphlets circulated, making wild promises. Rumours spread that the South Sea Company was about to open new markets. People invested their life savings, convinced they were about to be rich. And like all bubbles, it inflated far past reality. By 1720, the stock price skyrocketed from around £100 to over £1,000. Then it collapsed, spectacularly, wiping out fortunes and leaving coffeehouses echoing with angry voices and spilled coffee. A classic lesson in financial speculation. If your business plan involves convincing Spain to give us half their empire, maybe don't bet the farm. And yet, the image of all these gentlemen in wigs screaming at each other in Jonathan's coffeehouse is oddly comforting. Human nature hasn't changed much. Replace the wigs with Patagonia vests, the coffee with energy drinks, and you've basically got Wall Street today. But speculation wasn't the only game in town. Coffeehouses were also the birthplaces of actual news media. Before coffeehouses, news was mostly controlled by official gazettes or whispered through courtly gossip. In coffeehouses, though, you had pamphleteers, scrappy, caffeinated writers, churning out pages of political commentary and passing them hand to hand. One of the most famous was the Tatler, started by Richard Steele in 1709. Steele published under the name Isaac Bickerstaff, because pseudonyms made you sound more mysterious. The paper reported on everything from parliamentary debates to theatre reviews. Where did Steele gather his material? Coffeehouses, of course. He openly admitted he'd just sit there, listen to conversations, and write them up. So if you happen to mutter about politics over your coffee, congratulations, you might end up in tomorrow's paper. Then came The Spectator, founded by Steele and his friend Joseph Addison. That one was even more ambitious, aiming to improve public morals while entertaining readers. It claimed to reach thousands of Londoners every day. And coffeehouses were the distribution hubs, with stacks of issues passed around, smudged with ink and fingerprints. Governments hated this. Newspapers meant information was spreading without their control. Rumors could topple ministers. Pamphlets could whip up mobs. Coffeehouses became impossible to police, because the sheer volume of chatter drowned out the spies. Imagine trying to eavesdrop on 50 conversations at once while pretending you're really interested in the wallpaper. Not easy. And yet, surveillance was everywhere. The authorities planted informants in coffeehouses, hoping to catch sedition. Sometimes they did. Plots were real enough. But more often, they just overheard embarrassing conversations. Imagine the reports. Today I sat in Garraway's coffeehouse. 3 men complained the tax on beer was unfair. Another man insisted Newton's ideas were overrated. The mood was generally grumpy. Truly, intelligence at its finest. Still, monarchs remained nervous. George II supposedly distrusted coffeehouses so much he avoided passing near them. Louis XV in France kept a close eye on the Café Procope, fearing philosophers were turning into agitators. And to be fair, they weren't wrong. Many revolutions and reforms began as sleepy little chats over a hot cup. Now, let's slide over to one of my favorite characters in this caffeinated drama, Voltaire. Voltaire adored coffee. He drank it constantly, claiming it sharpened his mind. Some sources say he drank as many as 50 cups a day. Modern historians like to quibble about whether they were full cups or tiny demitasse servings. But either way, it was a lot. His doctor begged him to stop. Voltaire ignored him, of course. When you've made a career out of mocking kings and priests, ignoring your doctor is just another form of rebellion. And what did Voltaire do while jittering on endless espresso shots? He wrote. Constantly. Letters, plays, histories, philosophical treatises. Many of his sharpest critiques of monarchy and religion were drafted in the cozy chaos of Parisian cafes. He once quipped that coffee was a necessary luxury, which honestly sums up the Enlightenment itself, people convincing themselves that luxury was also progress. If you picture Voltaire hunched in a corner of the Café Procope, furiously scribbling while surrounded by other powdered intellectuals, you're not far off. He probably smelled faintly of ink, chocolate, and scorched beans. Truly the essence of genius. But not everyone loved coffee. Some critics despised it. Beyond the satire about men neglecting their wives, there were serious moralists who thought coffeehouses undermined society. They argued that instead of working, men wasted time gossiping. That instead of respecting authority, they mocked it. that instead of staying safely drunk on ale, they were now annoyingly alert. One pamphlet from the 1670s warned that coffee would make England a race of babblers. Which, if you've ever listened to British political debates, maybe wasn't entirely wrong. Meanwhile, in Vienna, coffeehouses took on their own flavor, literally. Legend has it that after the Battle of Vienna in 1683, when the Ottomans were defeated, sacks of strange beans were left behind. Locals didn't know what to do with them until a man named George Franz Kolschitsky, who had lived in the Ottoman Empire, brewed them into coffee. Vienna embraced it, adding milk and sugar to make it more palatable. Soon elegant Viennese cafes sprang up, complete with marble tables and respectable clientele. But even there, conspiracy theories brewed. Secret societies like the Freemasons were rumored to meet in cafes. Government agents prowled, ears open for dangerous talk. Everywhere coffee went, paranoia followed. Let's take a breath here. Coffeehouses might sound cozy, and they were, but underneath the chatter was a constant hum of unease. Monarchs feared them. Spies filled them. Investors ruined themselves inside them. And philosophers fueled revolutions with every sip. But that's the rhythm of the Enlightenment. On the surface, calm conversation, hot drinks, the murmur of debate. Underneath, bubbling conspiracies, scandals, and sometimes outright chaos. And as we keep floating, we'll wander next into how women, often excluded, found ways to make coffeehouses their own. We'll visit the rival world of salons, where conversation was even sharper, and the seating much nicer. And of course, we'll keep an eye on the endless parade of kings and ministers who couldn't stand the thought of their subjects staying up late, talking too much, and daring to have opinions. So refill your mug, and let's drift onward. So far, we've been wandering through smoky rooms filled mostly with men in wigs, loudly declaring things they only half understood. But what about women? After all, it wasn't as if half the population just vanished every time someone brewed a pot of coffee. Well, in many places, they were simply not allowed. London coffeehouses in particular earned a reputation as male clubs. The owners sometimes explicitly barred women, and when they didn't, the atmosphere often did. The rooms were crowded, loud, and thick with tobacco smoke, not exactly the kind of place respectable women were encouraged to linger. Unless, of course, they worked there as servers, which was a different story entirely. But women weren't silent. Remember that pamphlet I mentioned earlier, the Women's Petition Against Coffee from 1674? It might have been satire, but it struck a nerve. It painted coffeehouses as dens where men wasted time gossiping while their wives were stuck at home, bored and neglected. Whether or not the pamphlet was serious, it reflected a real tension. Coffeehouses created a new public sphere where women were, for the most part, excluded. Now, in France, things took a slightly different turn. Women still weren't major fixtures in cafes like the Procope, but they carved out their own parallel spaces, the salons. Salons were gatherings usually hosted by wealthy or aristocratic women in their own homes. Picture a grand drawing room lit by chandeliers, the smell of wax and perfume instead of burnt beans and pipe smoke. Instead of sticky oak benches, you had gilded chairs and velvet cushions. And instead of random merchants shouting about stocks, you had carefully curated guest lists of philosophers, poets, diplomats, and fashionable nobles. The hostess, known as the salonier, held real power. She steered the conversation, chose the topics, and decided who was in or out. In a society that often denied women political authority, the salon gave them influence through intellect and networking. Madame Geoffrin, for example, became one of the most famous salon hostesses of the 18th century. She gathered the likes of Diderot, Montesquieu, and Voltaire in her home. Another, Madame de Staël, later influenced political thought during and after the French Revolution. And yes, there were rivalries between salons, because even intellectuals can be petty. So while men slouched in smoky cafes, women presided over elegant salons, and both spheres churned out the ideas of the Enlightenment. It was a kind of gendered divide. Coffeehouses were loud, public, and messy. Salons were refined, private, and selective. And yet, conspiracies still lurked. Governments suspected salons as much as cafes, sometimes even more. In France, saloniers were accused of subtly steering political opinion. Which, to be fair, they often did. A clever hostess could flatter a minister, embarrass a rival, and shape the mood of a whole faction over the course of one evening's chatter. The irony is almost too perfect. Monarchs feared coffeehouses because ordinary men might talk politics. They feared salons because women might talk politics. In short, they feared everyone talking politics. Which really does beg the question of how they expected Enlightenment ideas not to spread. Let's float back to London for a moment, though. Because while women weren't common fixtures in coffeehouses, they did appear in satire. Writers loved to lampoon the idea of women barging in and disrupting the fragile egos of male debaters. Imagine the caricatures. Gentlemen frowning into their cups as a lady strolls in and effortlessly points out the flaws in their arguments. Of course, there were exceptions. Some women ran coffeehouses, which gave them a front row seat to all the chatter. Others slipped in anyway, especially those on the fringes of polite society. And there were always the pamphlets, poems, and satires, where women could speak indirectly even if not present in the room. So while women might not have been sipping lattes next to Voltaire, they weren't entirely absent either. They just found alternative routes to influence. Now, about those conspiracies. We've already seen how monarchs distrusted these spaces. But let's get into some specifics. In London, during the early 18th century, Jacobites, supporters of the exiled Stuart line, were rumoured to meet in coffeehouses. They supposedly plotted to restore the rightful king over steaming mugs. Whether they actually hatched elaborate schemes or just grumbled about Hanoverian accents is debatable, but the paranoia was real. In France, by the 1780s, paranoia had turned to panic. Revolution was in the air, and coffeehouses buzzed with discussions of bread prices, court scandals, and pamphlets denouncing the monarchy. Police informants filled the rooms, scribbling down names and overheard phrases. And yes, some of those mutterings led directly to arrests. The irony, again, is delicious. The more authorities tried to monitor coffeehouses, the more they confirmed everyone's suspicion that the government was untrustworthy. Nothing fuels conspiracy theories like the knowledge that spies really are listening in on your conversations. Even outside politics, coffeehouses were accused of fostering trouble. In some cities, they were linked to gambling, prostitution, and drunken brawls, though honestly, alehouses had been doing all of that for centuries. Coffeehouses just had the audacity to add pamphlets and intellectuals into the mix. And so governments wrestled with the question, should they shut them down? Tax them? Regulate them? Or just give up and hope everyone eventually got bored? The answer was usually a messy combination. Charles II failed at banning them outright. Later monarchs imposed taxes. In Paris, the police kept detailed records of cafes and their owners. In Vienna, licenses were required. Everywhere, the same uneasy dance. Rulers wanted control, but people wanted coffee. And if history teaches us anything, it's that people rarely give up caffeine without a fight. Let's pause for a sip. Imagine yourself in one of those rooms. It's late evening. The candles are burning low. Your wig itches. The coffee is lukewarm and bitter. But the conversation is endless. Around you, men argue about philosophy, trade, politics, and theatre. In the distance, you hear a pamphlet seller hawking his latest screed. And somewhere in the corner, a government spy pretends to enjoy his drink while writing down the names of everyone present. It's equal parts cozy and dangerous. Exactly the kind of setting where Enlightenment ideas thrived. And in our next gentle drift, we'll slide into the sheer weirdness of coffee culture itself. The health claims, the moral panics, the bizarre rituals. Because if you thought modern wellness influencers were bad, wait until you hear what 18th century doctors promised coffee could do. So take a breath, get comfortable, and let the candlelight dim a little more. We'll wander there next. So, we've seen how coffeehouses became rumor mills, stock exchanges, and breeding grounds for conspiracies. But underneath all of that, there was also the drink itself. Coffee. The bitter, black liquid at the center of all this chaos. And like any new trend, it attracted a tidal wave of medical claims, wellness advice, and outright nonsense. Because if you think modern influencers exaggerating the benefits of kale smoothies are bad, just wait until you hear what 17th and 18th century doctors promised a single cup of coffee could do. First, the miracle claims. Early medical writers insisted coffee cured everything from headaches to melancholy. One pamphlet argued that coffee could prevent scurvy, dropsy, and even the plague, which is quite the resume for a drink that mainly just makes you slightly less likely to nap. Another favorite claim: coffee was said to sober you up instantly. The idea was that after a night of heavy drinking, a few cups of coffee could restore you to perfect clarity. Anyone who's ever stumbled to a diner at 3 a.m. after too many shots knows this is optimistic. Sure, coffee might wake you up. It doesn't make you any less drunk. But apparently Enlightenment physicians weren't going to let facts get in the way of a good cure-all. Others insisted it boosted digestion, sharpened memory, and even cured bad breath. Which, considering the amount of garlic, onions, and questionable hygiene in the 18th century, was probably wishful thinking. Then there were the critics. For every glowing testimonial, there was someone warning that coffee would ruin your health forever. Some doctors claimed it dried out the body, leaving drinkers lean and haggard. Others said it weakened the stomach and caused vapors, which is an old-timey way of saying anxiety. A few even swore it caused impotence, because if you want to scare people away from a new habit, that's always the easiest threat. But the contradictions were constant. One pamphlet says coffee makes you fertile. Another says it makes you sterile. One says it cures melancholy. Another says it causes depression. Basically, it was the 18th century version of scrolling through WEBMD. Drink coffee, and you're either immortal or dying. Sometimes both. Let's pause to picture the ritual of coffee itself. Unlike ale, which you could gulp in any tavern, coffee had to be carefully brewed. The beans had to be roasted, ground, and steeped. The process gave it a kind of exotic aura. Drinking coffee wasn't just about hydration, it was a performance, a signal that you were part of something new and fashionable. In London, coffeehouses often had huge brass coffee pots sitting on stoves, constantly refilled throughout the day. The servers, sometimes called coffee boys, darted around pouring cups and wiping tables. The smell of roasted beans lingered on everyone's coats. In Paris, the ritual was even fancier. Coffee was often sweetened with sugar from colonial plantations and sometimes mixed with chocolate. The wealthy had porcelain cups imported from China, delicate and expensive. Sipping from one was a subtle flex. Not only could you afford exotic imports, but you also had the taste to prefer them over boring old wine. Vienna, as I mentioned earlier, added whipped cream, pastries, and newspapers, turning the cafe into a leisurely experience. There, coffee wasn't just a drink, it was a lifestyle. But because humans can't resist a moral panic, coffee also sparked fear about addiction. Some critics argued that once you started drinking it daily, you could never stop. That it enslaved the mind, weakened the body, and drained vitality. Which is not entirely wrong. Ask any modern coffee addict about their morning without caffeine. The headaches are very real. In fact, one physician described coffee drinkers as perpetually restless, their nerves in continual vibration. Which honestly sounds like half the Enlightenment thinkers we've already mentioned. It may not have been the philosophy making them so intense, it might have just been the espresso. And speaking of eccentric habits, let's drift back to Voltaire for a moment. He wasn't the only Enlightenment figure obsessed with coffee. Johann Sebastian Bach loved it so much he composed the Coffee Cantata, a miniature opera about a young woman who refuses to give up her daily fix despite her father's complaints. The whole plot is basically, you can take away my freedom, but you'll never take my coffee. A sentiment still deeply relatable today. Other composers, writers, and scientists followed similar patterns. They fueled their endless projects with endless cups. Coffeehouses weren't just meeting places, they were productivity hubs, the 18th century equivalent of co-working spaces. Only instead of laptops, there were quills. And instead of Slack notifications, there was someone loudly declaiming why Locke was wrong about human understanding. Of course, governments didn't like the health claims either. Because every time coffee was praised as a miracle drug, it gave people another excuse to gather in cafes. And so, official bans sometimes leaned on the argument that coffee was dangerous to public health. Ottoman sultans periodically outlawed it, sometimes with brutal enforcement, claiming it corrupted morals and ruined bodies. In England, Moralists spread pamphlets about its supposedly emasculating effects. But no matter how many warnings, the habit only spread further. Because once people discovered that a hot cup of caffeine made long hours of work, writing, or gossiping easier, there was no going back. Let's pause again. Imagine sitting in one of those rooms. You're holding a porcelain cup, its rim chipped from too much use. The coffee is bitter, with just a hint of sugar if you can afford it. The man next to you is insisting it will cure baldness. Another mutters that it ruined his cousin's health. A pamphlet circulates claiming both at once. And through it all, the steady murmur of conversation never stops. That's the real charm of coffee culture in the Enlightenment. It wasn't just about taste. It wasn't even about health. It was about belonging to a new rhythm of life. The endless buzz of chatter, the hum of caffeine, the sense that something important, something world-changing, might come from the next sip, the next debate, the next half-baked pamphlet. And in our next gentle drift, we'll wander into how coffeehouses began shaping entire economies. We'll look at Lloyd's Coffee House, which grew into Lloyd's of London, the global insurance market. We'll trace how shipping, trade, and even empire were fueled by men in wigs scribbling contracts over mugs of coffee. Because nothing says world domination quite like spilling ink on a sticky oak table. So let's settle back, let the candlelight dim a little more, and prepare to follow coffee into the world of money and empire. So, we've drifted through the smoky debates, the pamphlets, the medical exaggerations, and the endless cups fueling Enlightenment philosophers. Now let's wander into something a little drier, though no less absurd. The way coffeehouses became the birthplace of giant economic institutions. Because it turns out that sometimes, world-changing businesses don't begin in glittering boardrooms or royal palaces. They start in a cramped room where half the customers are shouting about pamphlets and the other half are trying not to spill on their wigs. The most famous example, of course, is Lloyd's Coffee House. If you've ever heard of Lloyd's of London, the insurance market that still exists today, it started not with a polished corporation, but with Edward Lloyd, a man who owned a coffee house in Tower Street in the late 1600s. Lloyd catered to sailors, merchants, and ship owners, which meant his coffee house quickly filled with the chatter of voyages, cargoes, and the endless risks of sailing wooden ships across oceans that wanted nothing more than to sink them. To keep business flowing, Lloyd began providing shipping news and lists of vessels. He also welcomed men who wanted to gamble on whether a ship would make it home. Out of that casual gambling, modern insurance was born. So picture it. You're in a cramped room smelling of stale coffee and seawater. Merchants are haggling over policies, literally writing contracts on scraps of paper over steaming mugs. Yes, I'll insure your cargo of sugar for this much. No, I won't touch your ship bound for Jamaica. The hurricane season looks nasty. This is the Enlightenment equivalent of high finance. A bunch of jittery men betting on whether ships sink. And from that chaos grew Lloyd's of London, one of the most powerful insurance markets in the world. All because Edward Lloyd had good coffee, better gossip, and enough table space for signatures. But Lloyd's wasn't the only one. The London Stock Exchange traces its roots to Jonathan's Coffee House, which we already met during the South Sea bubble debacle. Traders crowded into the place, scribbling orders and shouting prices. There was no regulation, no government oversight, just wigs, coffee, and greed. Which explains why bubbles inflated and burst with such spectacular drama. It's ironic, really. For all the high-minded talk of reason and progress, some of the most rational men of the Enlightenment were frantically gambling away fortunes in coffee houses. Humanity's love of risk apparently didn't vanish just because people were quoting Locke and Newton. And then there's empire. Coffee houses didn't just fuel speculation, they fueled the imperial imagination. The chatter wasn't limited to local politics. Merchants gossiped about India, Africa, and the Americas. Colonial ventures were dissected, investments discussed, and plans hatched. Coffee houses became little command centers where empire was dreamed up over mugs of, ironically, a colonial product. Because let's not forget, coffee itself was an imperial commodity. By the 18th century, much of Europe's supply came from colonies. Java under the Dutch, the Caribbean under the French, the Middle East under Ottoman oversight. Every sip was tied to global trade networks, to plantations worked by enslaved labor, to ships risking storms and pirates. When you raised a cup in London or Paris, you were drinking empire in liquid form. That irony wasn't lost on everyone. Some pamphlets acknowledged the darker side of the trade, but most drinkers were too busy enjoying the buzz and the gossip to think too hard about the labor behind their cup. Just like today, really. And while we're on the subject of empire, let's glide for a moment to the Ottoman world. Because Europe didn't invent coffeehouses, far from it. They had existed in the Middle East since at least the 1500s. Constantinople, Cairo, Mecca, all had thriving cafe cultures long before London ever smelled a roasted bean. Ottoman sultans, too, feared their coffeehouses. They tried to ban them repeatedly, sometimes even sending officials to smash coffee pots and punish owners. The reason was always the same: men gathered there to talk. And whenever men gathered to talk, conspiracies brewed. Which, to be fair, was usually correct. Coffeehouses in Istanbul were filled with gossip about politics, religion, and court intrigue. They were hotbeds of satire, storytelling, and occasionally full-on plots against the Sultan. Sound familiar? The pattern repeats everywhere. Rulers hate coffeehouses, subjects love them, and somehow the bans never stick. Because once people discover the magical combination of caffeine and conversation, there's no going back. Back in Europe, the economic side only grew. By the late 18th century, a London merchant might spend his entire day hopping from one coffeehouse to another. Morning at Lloyd's for shipping news, midday at Jonathan's for stocks, evening at Garraway's for auctions. Each house specialized, carving out a niche. They weren't just social clubs anymore, they were nodes in the city's financial network. And yet, they still looked like dingy rooms with uneven floors and a constant smell of stale tobacco. The contrast is almost funny. Empire, finance, and insurance were being plotted out in spaces that barely had decent lighting. But somehow it worked. Of course, not everyone appreciated the blending of money and mugs. Satirists loved to lampoon the financial chaos. Caricatures showed merchants frantically waving papers, their wigs falling off, coffee spilling everywhere. Pamphlets warned that coffeehouses were dens of fraud, speculation, and ruin. And honestly, they weren't wrong. The South Sea bubble alone was proof enough. But despite the warnings, people kept coming. Because where else could you combine the latest shipping gossip with a shot of caffeine? Where else could you find investors, insurers, pamphleteers, and philosophers all crammed into the same space? Coffeehouses were messy, but they were indispensable. Let's pause here again. Imagine sitting at Lloyd's in 1705. The air is thick with smoke. A clerk is reading aloud the latest shipping news. Merchants are hunched over tables, scribbling contracts. A sailor bursts in with a rumor about a storm off Barbados. A government spy sits in the corner, pretending to drink while trying to follow the chaos. And in the middle of it all, Edward Lloyd himself smiles, knowing his little coffeehouse has become the beating heart of an empire's trade. All from coffee. Bitter, black, endlessly argued about coffee. And in our next gentle drift, we'll leave money behind for a while and wander into the literary side of coffeehouses. We'll meet the poets, playwrights, and pamphleteers who found inspiration, and often, humiliation, inside those crowded rooms. We'll see how reputations were made and destroyed over a single cup. Because if you think Twitter feuds are bad, you should hear what Alexander Pope said about his critics after a few mugs of coffee. So get comfortable, take another sip, and let's float toward the world of coffeehouse literature. So far, we've lingered among merchants, investors, and jittery philosophers. But if there was any group of people who truly thrived in the chaos of coffeehouses, it was the writers. Because coffeehouses weren't just about money or politics, they were about words. And for an 18th century writer, words meant everything: fame, fortune, humiliation, or all three at once. Let's start with the poets. Alexander Pope, one of the most famous poets of the early 18th century, was no stranger to coffeehouse culture. He was small, sickly, and often irritable, but he was also razor-sharp. Coffeehouses gave him an arena where wit mattered more than height or health. Pope was notorious for skewering his critics with satirical verse. If someone insulted him in a coffeehouse, he had the nuclear option, immortalizing their stupidity in rhyme. Which, frankly, is still one of the best revenge strategies available. Jonathan Swift, author of Gulliver's Travels, also haunted London coffeehouses. Swift loved conversation, especially when it gave him material for satire. He'd listen to endless arguments and then distill them into biting essays. His friend Steele joked that Swift could make a pamphlet out of any coffeehouse quarrel, and it would still outsell everyone else's work. And then there were the lesser-known poets, the hopeful scribblers who crowded coffeehouses, desperate to impress. Some managed to catch the eye of a patron. Others were mocked into obscurity. Coffeehouses could launch a literary career, but they could also bury one beneath laughter and spilled coffee. Beyond poetry, coffeehouses were the nerve centers of journalism. We've already seen Steele and Addison's Spectator, but countless smaller publications sprang from the same environment. Pamphlets, broadsheets, weekly news, most of it written quickly, distributed cheaply, and devoured eagerly. This created what historians sometimes call the paper wars. Writers insulted each other in print, readers debated the insults in coffeehouses, and the cycle repeated endlessly. If you think online flame wars are new, they're not. The only difference is that instead of hiding behind screen names, 18th century writers signed their attacks, or at least used a recognizable pseudonym, which made the insults sharper, the feuds nastier, and the revenge sweeter. One week, a writer would publish an essay mocking a rival's style. The next week, the rival would retaliate with a pamphlet questioning the first writer's morals, politics, or choice of wig. Coffeehouses devoured this drama. People gathered around to hear pamphlets read aloud, laughing at the insults, arguing about the details, and occasionally throwing their own shade across the table. It was petty, it was theatrical, and it was addictive. Exactly like today's social media. Theatre critics, too, made coffeehouses their headquarters. Playwrights dreaded the morning after a premiere, when critics would gather over coffee to decide whether a new play was brilliant or dreadful. Their reviews often spread faster than the official newspapers. A single cutting remark overheard in a coffeehouse could ruin a playwright's season. Of course, critics weren't immune to criticism themselves. They were mocked as parasites, clinging to the work of real artists. But they kept writing, and the coffeehouses kept giving them audiences. Then there were the philosophers. We've already talked about Voltaire, jittering on 50 cups a day. But he wasn't alone. Diderot, Montesquieu, Rousseau, they all thrived on coffeehouse culture. They debated endlessly, scribbled constantly, and annoyed the authorities without pause. Rousseau in particular was famous for storming out of conversations, convinced everyone misunderstood him. Imagine the scene, a crowded cafe, candles burning low, Rousseau furiously gathering his papers while muttering that society is corrupt and nobody appreciates his genius. Everyone else sighs, takes another sip, and waits for him to come back tomorrow. Which, of course, he did. But perhaps the most amusing aspect of literary coffeehouse culture was the sheer amount of gossip. Writers gossiped about each other constantly. Who had offended a patron? Who was broke again? Who was sleeping with whose mistress? The chatter was endless. And because many of these writers were also journalists, the gossip often ended up in print, thinly disguised. One week, a satirical essay would describe a certain poet who had begged for money. Everyone knew who it was. The next week, the poet would retaliate with a story about a certain essayist who had been caught drunk in an alley. Everyone knew that one too. Coffeehouses loved this cycle, feeding it with fresh rumors every day. Let's pause to imagine one of these universities. The room is dim, crowded, and buzzing with talk. At one table, a merchant explains the mysteries of double-entry bookkeeping to an eager apprentice. At another, a sailor describes far-off lands, exaggerating wildly, while listeners scribble notes. In the corner, a group of clerks read aloud from the latest Spectator, laughing at its satire. Everyone is learning something, whether they realize it or not. No diplomas, no professors in gowns, just endless words over endless cups of coffee. And yet, even here, conspiracies were never far away. Because once people learned to question trade, politics, and religion, they also learned to suspect corruption, secrets, and plots. Some of it was paranoia. Some of it was true. Either way, coffeehouses trained people not just to think, but to doubt. And doubt, once planted, is hard to erase. In our next gentle drift, We'll follow coffeehouses into their decline, how the very forces that made them exciting eventually made them obsolete. We'll see how newspapers, clubs, and changing tastes pushed them aside, and how the romantic image of the Enlightenment cafe slowly gave way to new forms of public life. So take another sip, let the warmth settle, and we'll float there next. We've spent hours now wandering through the noisy, smoky rooms of Enlightenment coffeehouses. But like all fashions, even this golden age couldn't last forever. By the end of the 18th century, the coffeehouse as a central hub of public life was already in decline. The reasons were many, some practical, some cultural, and some just the slow creep of changing habits. First, newspapers. In the early days, if you wanted news, you went to a coffeehouse. You read pamphlets, shared newsletters, or listened to someone read aloud. But as printing grew faster, cheaper, and more regular, newspapers became easier to buy on your own. Instead of crowding into a noisy room, you could sit at home with a private copy. The coffeehouse wasn't the only newsstand anymore. Second, the rise of clubs. Wealthier men decided they preferred something a little more exclusive than rubbing shoulders with clerks, sailors, and loud pamphleteers. So they started forming private clubs, often in elegant buildings with better chairs, more refined menus, and far fewer strangers. Whites, Brookses, Boodles. These London clubs grew out of coffeehouse culture but left behind the egalitarian mix. If the coffeehouse was a penny university, the club was the graduate school that charged tuition and checked your lineage at the door. Third, tea. Yes, tea. By the late 18th century, Britain had fallen head over heels for the leaves of China and India. Tea drinking exploded, especially at home. It was cleaner, gentler, and less controversial. Instead of venturing into crowded coffeehouses, families gathered in parlors around teapots. Coffee never disappeared, but it had to share the stage. There were also more subtle reasons. Governments kept a close eye on coffeehouses. Taxes increased, licenses became stricter, and the air of suspicion never quite faded. For some, the effort of running one simply wasn't worth it. Many closed or transformed into taverns, clubs, or insurance offices. The rooms that had once buzzed with political chatter now echoed with more private deals. And then there was fashion. Coffeehouses were, at heart, a 17th and early 18th century phenomenon. By the 19th century, tastes shifted toward quieter, more polished spaces. The Victorian era preferred gentility over chaos. The coffeehouse, with its sticky tables and loud arguments, began to feel old-fashioned. That doesn't mean they vanished entirely. In some cities, they evolved into modern cafes. In Vienna, for instance, coffeehouse culture never really ended. It just refined itself into something elegant, complete with marble tables, polished service, and a slower pace. In Paris, too, the cafe remained central, though it took on a more leisurely, artistic air rather than a purely political one. But in London, the classic Enlightenment coffeehouse, the penny university, the gossip den, the pamphlet-scribbling hive, slowly faded. By the early 1800s, only a few remained, and those that did were often unrecognizable compared to their boisterous ancestors. It's tempting to imagine the last days of a great coffeehouse. Picture Jonathan's, once filled with frenzied traders, now quieter, its tables less crowded. A few loyal customers still linger, reading newspapers instead of shouting rumors. The air of excitement has dimmed, replaced by something slower, more subdued. Outside, newer clubs rise, drawing away the wealthy. Inside, the ghosts of pamphlets and spilled ink remain, but the energy is gone. Like all things, the coffeehouse had its moment, and then it passed. But its legacy lingered. The conversations sparked in those cramped rooms reshaped politics, literature, finance, and philosophy. Revolutions were whispered there, fortunes gambled there, reputations made and destroyed there. Even as the physical spaces faded, the habits they created, debate, news sharing, speculation, moved on to other venues. And in many ways, we never stopped. Today's social media platforms are just the latest version. Loud, chaotic, filled with rumor, gossip, politics, and occasional brilliance. Swap the wigs for Wi-Fi, the pamphlets for posts, and the sticky oak tables for smartphone screens, and the pattern is the same. Coffeehouses may have declined, but the culture they nurtured never really died. Let's pause one last time. Imagine the candlelight flickering low, the chatter slowly fading, the room emptying. The smell of coffee lingers in the air. The great age of the Enlightenment coffeehouse is ending, but its echoes stretch forward through centuries, right up to us. And with that, we can gently close the door on this long, winding journey. The conspiracies, the pamphlets, the gossip, the revolutions, all of it began with a cup of coffee and a room full of people who simply wouldn't stop talking. So, if you're still awake, congratulations. You've just survived a few hours in the company of the world's most caffeinated thinkers. And if you've dozed off somewhere between Lloyd's insurance contracts and Voltaire's 50 cups a day, that's fine too. The coffeehouses will still be there, buzzing quietly in history, waiting for you to return. Now we're restarting with one of the stranger episodes in medieval history. And that's saying something, because the Middle Ages were already a circus of oddities. So go ahead, dim the lights, grab something warm to drink, and prepare to relax while we talk about a courtroom trial. Which, admittedly, doesn't sound too bad. But here's the catch, the defendant was a corpse. Yes, welcome to the late 9th century, when the papacy had all the stability of a soap opera and the logic of a fever dream. The event is usually called the Cadaver Synod, though I prefer its alternate nickname, the Trial of the Corpse. And if you're wondering, yes, they really did drag a dead pope into a courtroom, prop him up on a throne, and put him on trial. Because apparently, excommunicating someone wasn't dramatic enough. But before we get to the rotting centerpiece of this story, let's float back a little. Because this was not just some random act of medieval weirdness. It was the messy culmination of decades of squabbling over who got to sit in the papal chair. And as with most medieval politics, it had less to do with piety and more to do with dynasties, revenge, and the endless parade of people who thought they should be the one running the church. So, who was this unfortunate corpse? His name was Formosus, which, by the way, is Latin for handsome. And if you're picturing a dashing medieval pope with movie star looks, calm down. Nicknames in history are rarely accurate. Sometimes the handsome looked like a wilted cabbage. Sometimes the brave was actually terrified of his own horse. It's part of the charm. Formosus himself was born around 816. He came from Rome, or at least from somewhere close enough that Rome claimed him, and like most ambitious clerics, he climbed the church hierarchy step by step. He became Bishop of Porto, which was a decent enough gig. But Formosus had bigger dreams. He wanted the papacy. And unfortunately, so did about 10 other people. The 9th century papacy was less about holy guidance and more about political alliances. Italian nobles treated the papal throne like a chess piece in their constant squabbles. Add in the Carolingian dynasty, the heirs of Charlemagne, and you had a recipe for disaster. Popes were chosen, deposed, reinstated, sometimes poisoned, sometimes imprisoned. Being pope was less of a blessing and more of a high-stakes gamble with your life expectancy. Formosus, to his credit, was talented at politics. He navigated between factions, supported the right nobles at the right times, and made himself useful to the Frankish kings. He had enemies, of course, because everyone did. But by 891, he finally achieved his dream. He became pope. And for about 5 years, things weren't terrible. Well, relatively speaking. His papacy was still marked by endless political tug-of-war between Roman aristocrats and Carolingian claimants. But compared to what came next, Formosus was practically a model of stability. He crowned emperors, made alliances, shuffled bishops around like chess pieces. You know, the usual. Then in 896, he died. Peacefully, in bed, which was honestly an achievement for a medieval pope. He was buried with full honors. And normally, that would have been the end of his story. Except, of course, it wasn't. Because the papacy could never resist one last round of drama. Enter Stephen VI. Poor Stephen. He was the unlucky man who inherited the papacy after Formosus. And he had a problem. Politics. Always politics. Stephen owed his papacy to a powerful faction in Rome aligned with the Spoleto family, a dynasty that had been fighting tooth and nail for influence in Italy. The Spoltans hated Formosus. They believed he had undermined their power, backed the wrong emperors, and generally made life difficult for them. So when Stephen became pope, they expected him to deal with Formosus's memory once and for all. Now, most people would have just badmouthed the dead pope in a sermon, or maybe quietly removed his supporters from office. But Stephen went further. Much further. Because apparently, slandering a corpse wasn't enough. He decided to drag the actual corpse into court. Yes. In 897, Stephen ordered the body of Pope Formosus exhumed. And not just exhumed, dressed back up in papal robes, placed on a throne, and put on trial in front of the Roman clergy. This was the infamous Cadaver Synod. Let's pause here. Take a breath. Imagine the scene. It's January, the air is cold and damp. The Lateran Basilica is crowded with clergy, nobles, and curious onlookers. At the front, Stephen sits in his papal chair, glaring with all the seriousness he can muster. And next to him is a corpse, propped up on a throne, wearing tattered robes, its body stiff and grotesque after months in the ground. Its face is probably sunken, its hands shriveled. This is the defendant. And because corpses don't speak for themselves, a deacon was appointed to act as Formosus's defense. His job? To answer questions on behalf of the body. Which is, honestly, one of the worst job descriptions in history. Imagine standing there while Pope Stephen thunders accusations at a corpse, and you have to mumble some excuse like, "The defendant pleads not guilty." I think. The charges against Formosus were, let's say, imaginative. He was accused of perjury, of violating canon law, of illegally transferring himself between bishoprics. Basically, he was guilty of being too ambitious, too political, and not aligning with the right family at the right time. In other words, the usual sins of every pope of the era. But Stephen framed it as a matter of divine justice. Formosus had corrupted the papacy, and his memory had to be destroyed. And so, the trial proceeded. Witnesses were called. Arguments were made. The corpse sat there silently, probably leaning at a strange angle because rigor mortis is not great for posture. Unsurprisingly, the verdict was guilty. Formosus's papacy was declared null and void. His decrees were annulled. His body was stripped of its robes, the 3 fingers he had used for blessings were cut off, and finally, his corpse was tossed into the Tiber River. Trial concluded. Justice served. Except, not really. Because far from securing Stephen's authority, the Cadaver Synod backfired spectacularly. The sight of a pope screaming at a corpse horrified even the jaded citizens of Rome. People whispered that Stephen had gone mad, that he had insulted the dignity of the church, that the whole thing was grotesque even by papal standards. Which is saying a lot. Within months, riots broke out. Stephen was deposed, imprisoned, and eventually strangled in his cell. Formosus, meanwhile, became something of a martyr figure. His body, fished out of the Tiber, was reburied with honors. Later popes annulled the Cadaver Synod, restored his reputation, and quietly tried to pretend the whole thing had never happened. Of course, history remembered. Because you can bury a scandal, but once you've dragged a corpse into court, people tend to talk about it for centuries. Let's pause again. The Cadaver Synod is often presented as one of the weirdest moments in papal history. And it is. But it's also a window into just how unstable the papacy was in this era. Popes rose and fell like mayflies. Nobles treated the church as just another pawn in their feuds. And when all else failed, they dragged their enemies out of the grave to humiliate them one last time. It's absurd. It's grotesque. And it's also a reminder that medieval politics could be just as petty, personal, and ridiculous as anything we deal with today. Only with more corpses. In our next gentle drift, we'll float deeper into the world around the Cadaver Synod. We'll look at the dynastic rivalries that fueled it, the unstable carousel of popes who came before and after, and the way this bizarre event became part of the legend of papal corruption. Because while Stephen VI may have gone down in history as the man who yelled at a corpse, he was really just the symptom of a much bigger disease. So settle in, refill your cup, and prepare to wander further into the strange world of 9th century Rome. So, to really understand why poor Pope Formosus ended up as courtroom decor, we need to zoom out and take a look at the papacy of the late 9th century. Because this wasn't just one weird pope having a breakdown. This was the climax of decades of instability, factional warfare, and aristocratic meddling. In other words, Rome being Rome. First, a little context. After the death of Charlemagne in 814, Europe entered what historians like to politely call a transitional period, which is just a fancy way of saying everything fell apart. His grand empire was carved up among squabbling heirs. Nobles grabbed power wherever they could, and Rome, sitting awkwardly in the middle of Italy, became the prize everyone wanted to control. The papacy in this period was less a spiritual office and more a political hot potato. Every local noble family wanted their candidate on the papal throne, because controlling the pope meant controlling land, money, and, most importantly, legitimacy. If your side had the pope's blessing, you could crown emperors, excommunicate rivals, and generally strut around acting like God was on your team. Of course, if the wrong pope got in, your enemies suddenly had that power instead. Which is why popes in the 9th century came and went at an alarming rate. Some sources claim there were 24 different popes between 872 and 965. That's almost one pope every 4 years. A turnover rate that makes even modern politics look stable. One of the most influential families in this circus was the Spoleto dynasty. The Dukes of Spoleto were powerful nobles in central Italy who fancied themselves kingmakers. They wanted popes who would support their ambitions, and they weren't shy about using threats, bribes, or outright violence to get them. Think of them as the overbearing in-laws of the papacy, always meddling, never satisfied, and somehow always at the dinner table. Formosus, during his career, had the misfortune of clashing with the Spoltans. He was accused of backing rival claimants to the imperial throne, especially Arnulf of Carinthia, a Frankish king who invaded Italy in the 890s. When Arnulf marched into Rome, Formosus crowned him emperor, snubbing the Spoltan candidate. Needless to say, this didn't win him any friends in Spoleto. So when Formosus died, the Spoltans saw their chance for revenge. Their man, Stephen VI, was elevated to the papacy, and almost immediately, they pushed him to undo everything Formosus had done, literally. Not just politically, but physically. Now, to be fair, Stephen wasn't the first pope to dig up old grievances. The church had a habit of retroactively condemning rivals. But normally this was done with words, not with rotting corpses. For example, earlier popes had occasionally declared their predecessors' decrees invalid, or quietly erased their names from official records. It was a tidy, bureaucratic sort of vengeance. The Cadaver Synod, however, was a whole new level of petty. It was as if the Spoltans thought, if we're going to cancel this man's papacy, why not really make a statement? Why not parade his body around and make everyone watch? Because nothing says political power quite like screaming at someone who can't argue back. But to appreciate just how surreal it must have felt, let's take a little stroll through the papal lineup leading up to Stephen VI. Take Pope John VIII, for example. He reigned from 872 to 882 and was considered one of the more competent popes of the century. He tried to strengthen Rome's defenses, negotiated with Byzantium, and even supported missions in Eastern Europe. Unfortunately, his reign ended in classic 9th century style, assassination. He was either poisoned, clubbed to death, or both. Sources differ, but either way, he didn't retire peacefully. Then came a string of short-lived popes. Marinus I, who only lasted 2 years. Hadrian III, who died under suspicious circumstances while traveling. Stephen V, who reigned for 7 years but constantly clashed with noble families. Each pope was essentially a placeholder in the endless struggle between Roman aristocrats and Frankish kings. By the time Formosus arrived in 891, the papacy was already wobbling like a rickety chair. His decision to crown Arnulf only made the wobble worse. And when Arnulf himself conveniently suffered a stroke soon after, probably divine punishment, according to his enemies, the Spoltans pounced. So, when Stephen VI took the papal throne in 896, he inherited not just the title but a laundry list of grudges. He wasn't a particularly strong-willed man, and the Spoltans made sure he understood that his job wasn't to rule independently but to undo Formosus's legacy. Which is why, within a year, we get the macabre spectacle of the Cadaver Synod. It's easy to laugh at the absurdity now, but for contemporaries, it was deadly serious. Declaring Formosus's papacy invalid wasn't just about embarrassing him, it also invalidated everything he had done. That meant the bishops he appointed were suddenly illegitimate. The emperor he crowned was suddenly usurping. Every decision he made was called into question. It was political chaos disguised as divine judgment. But here's the thing. Even in the 9th century, people had limits. Watching your pope shriek accusations at a corpse in front of a packed church was apparently a bridge too far. The Cadaver Synod scandalized the city. Instead of cowing Formosus's supporters, it rallied them. Ordinary Romans began to whisper that Stephen had lost his mind, or worse, that he had blasphemed against the dignity of the church itself. And in Rome, once public opinion turned, it turned fast. Within months of the trial, mobs rose against Stephen. He was stripped of office, thrown in prison, and eventually strangled. His papacy lasted barely a year, which, honestly, was about average for the time. Let's pause again. The Cadaver Synod is often remembered as a bizarre one-off, but in reality, it was the logical endpoint of decades of corruption, factionalism, and aristocratic interference. When every pope was the pawn of one family or another, when crowns were handed out and taken back like party favors, when vengeance outweighed dignity, it was almost inevitable that someone would take it too far. Stephen VI just happened to be the unlucky man who crossed that line. In our next gentle drift, we'll linger with the aftermath. Because the Cadaver Synod didn't just end with Stephen's downfall. Later popes kept revisiting the question, trying to undo, or in some cases, redo, the verdict. The corpse of Formosus had more legal comebacks than most living men. And through it all, the papacy sank deeper into the swamp of 10th century politics, an era so notorious it's sometimes called the pornocracy. Which, yes, is exactly as messy as it sounds. So settle in, let the candlelight glow, and we'll wander there next. So, we left off with Stephen VI shrieking at a corpse, Rome recoiling in horror, and the whole affair spiraling out of control. You'd think that would be the end of the story. One pope goes mad, the corpse gets dunked in the Tiber, and everyone moves on, maybe a little traumatized, but wiser for it. But no. This is the 9th and 10th century papacy we're talking about. When has anyone ever just moved on? Stephen VI's downfall was swift. Romans had tolerated plenty of papal shenanigans, but putting a decomposing body on trial was a new low. Public opinion turned on him almost immediately. Crowds rioted, nobles withdrew support, and soon Stephen was thrown into prison. By August of 897, he was strangled to death in his cell. Cause of death? Politics, as usual. But the Cadaver Synod didn't die with him. The corpse of Formosus continued to haunt papal politics for years, dragged back into legal arguments again and again, as if Rome couldn't quite decide what to do with its guilty ghost. After Stephen's grisly exit, Pope Romanus took the throne. His reign lasted all of a few months, because of course it did, but in that short time, he annulled the Cadaver Synod. Formosus was posthumously rehabilitated, his decrees reinstated, and everyone pretended the whole corpse on trial episode was a bad dream. But then came Theodore II, whose papacy lasted a grand total of 20 days. Yes, 20. Which is less a papacy and more a particularly stressful vacation. Still, in those 3 weeks, Theodore doubled down on rehabilitating Formosus. He had the body retrieved from the Tiber, or what was left of it, reburied with dignity, and officially declared the Cadaver Synod invalid. For a brief moment, it looked like Formosus might finally rest in peace. Naturally, that peace didn't last. Enter Pope Sergius III. Sergius had been a supporter of Stephen VI back in the corpse trial days, and when he finally became Pope in 904, he revived the Cadaver Synod's verdict. Yes, he once again declared Formosus guilty. For those keeping score, that's at least 3 times the poor man's reputation was officially flipped from guilty to innocent and back again. More legal drama than most people manage while alive. Sergius had Formosus's ordinations annulled once more, which meant anyone who had been made a bishop or priest by him was suddenly illegitimate again. Of course, this caused chaos, since half the clergy owed their positions to Formosus. Some of them had to be reordained, as if hitting refresh on their holy status. It was bureaucracy at its most absurd. The message was clear: the corpse of Formosus was still politically useful. He was a pawn in the endless tug-of-war between factions, dragged back and forth like a ragdoll, even years after decomposition. Let's pause and take this in. Imagine being a Roman in the early 10th century. You've watched your city descend into one pope after another, each one clawing at the legacy of the last. One year, Formosus is guilty, his corpse rotting in the river. The next, he's innocent, reburied with honor. Then guilty again, his decrees erased. Then maybe innocent, depending on who's in charge that week. It must have felt like living in a never-ending courtroom drama where the main character was already dead. And as if that weren't enough, the papacy itself entered an even darker period. Historians sometimes call the early 10th century the Saeculum Obscurum, the dark age of the papacy, or, less politely, the pornocracy. And no, that doesn't mean the popes were writing racy poetry. It refers to the domination of the papacy by a handful of powerful Roman noblewomen, especially Theodora and her daughter Marozia of the Theophylacti family. These women effectively ran Rome, installing and deposing popes as they pleased. Sergius III, the one who revived the Cadaver Synod's verdict, was rumored to be Marozia's lover. Together, they turned the papacy into their personal playground, with popes serving at the pleasure of their faction. So while Formosus's corpse was dragged back and forth through posthumous trials, the living papacy was busy entangling itself in scandals, power plays, and dynastic drama. If the Cadaver Synod seemed grotesque, the years that followed weren't exactly an improvement. But let's not lose sight of the irony here. The entire point of the Cadaver Synod had been to erase Formosus's legacy. And yet, the trial ensured that he would be remembered forever. If Stephen VI had simply ignored his predecessor, Formosus might have faded into obscurity, one more pope among dozens in a chaotic century. Instead, by putting his corpse on trial, Stephen made Formosus immortal in the most bizarre way possible. Because let's be honest, how many other 9th century popes can you name off the top of your head? Exactly. But Formosus. Everyone remembers the one who got dragged into court after death. There's also something telling about the constant flip-flopping of verdicts. It shows just how fragile papal authority was. Far from being the all-powerful, untouchable institution we sometimes imagine, the papacy in this period was basically a hostage to Roman politics. Each new pope scrambled to rewrite the past in his faction's favor, even if it meant contradicting his predecessor. Stability wasn't even on the table. And in a strange way, the Cadaver Synod is the perfect symbol of that instability. A corpse dragged from the grave, dressed in holy robes, condemned, exonerated, condemned again. It's a metaphor acted out in grim pantomime. Let's pause here, let the candlelight flicker, and imagine the late Ram Basilica not during the trial, but in the years after. The corpse is gone, reburied who knows how many times. But the memory lingers. Clergy whisper about it. Ordinary Romans shake their heads at the madness of it all. And every new pope knows, deep down, that his reputation too could be dragged out and shredded, even after death. In our next gentle drift, we'll wander into the broader consequences. How the Cadaver Synod became a symbol of papal corruption, how later centuries retold the story with horror or glee, and how even in the Renaissance and beyond, people still shook their heads at the time Rome put a corpse on trial. So refill your cup, settle deeper into your blanket, and let's keep floating through this strange river of history. So, we've wandered through the courtroom, seen the corpse condemned, watched Stephen VI dragged off to prison, and followed the endless flip-flopping of guilty, innocent, guilty again. By now, you'd think the story would finally rest in peace. But if there's one thing the Cadaver Synod proves, it's that peace was never the papacy's strong suit in the 9th and 10th centuries. Because the strange thing about the Cadaver Synod isn't just that it happened. It's that people remembered. In an age when dozens of short-lived popes flickered in and out of office like candles in the wind, the Cadaver Synod lodged itself firmly in the collective memory. Chroniclers and gossip. Medieval chroniclers didn't hold back. Some recorded the event with grim disapproval, others with a certain morbid relish. You can almost hear the sighs in their writing, and then Pope Stephen, in his infinite wisdom, exhumed his predecessor and screamed at him for a while. The universal consensus was that it was grotesque. For later writers, the Cadaver Synod became shorthand for papal corruption. If you wanted to argue that Rome had lost its way, you pointed to the time it put a corpse on trial. Protestant reformers in the 16th century absolutely loved this story. It was too perfect, a literal dead pope on trial, proof that the papacy was a mess long before Martin Luther ever picked up a hammer. Even Renaissance humanists, who tried to admire the grandeur of Rome's past, couldn't help but roll their eyes at the memory of Stephen VI yelling at a skeleton in robes. Symbolism and irony. The symbolism practically writes itself. A dead pope, propped on a throne, accused of corruption. It was a living metaphor, or rather, a dead one. The papacy itself was supposed to be eternal, the rock of the church. Instead, it looked like a decaying body dragged into court, torn apart by politics. The imagery was too strong to ignore. Ironically, Stephen's attempt to erase Formosus's legacy made him immortal in exactly the wrong way. Out of all the popes of the 9th century, it is Formosus and Stephen VI we still talk about. Not because of their reforms, not because of their theology, but because one yelled at the other's corpse. Sometimes history rewards the strangest things. The moral lesson, or lack thereof. Later commentators often tried to extract a moral lesson. Some said it showed the dangers of vengeance. Others argued it proved God's judgment eventually punished Stephen, since he ended up strangled in prison. Still others just used it as a cautionary tale about letting politics run wild inside the church. But there's also a sense in which it had no lesson at all. It was pure chaos, the inevitable result of a system where the papacy was less about holiness and more about which aristocratic faction could shout the loudest. In that sense, the Cadaver Synod wasn't an exception. It was business as usual, just with worse stage props. Later comparisons. As centuries rolled on, people kept dredging up the Cadaver Synod as a comparison point. Whenever the papacy fell into scandal, someone would mutter, "Well, at least nobody's dragging corpses into court this time." It became a kind of dark benchmark. If you thought the Pope was corrupt in your century, just remember, it could be worse. The Enlightenment, with its love of mocking church authority, also seized on the story. Voltaire and his fellow philosophers pointed to it as proof that religion was a breeding ground for absurdity. Imagine their glee. The church that claimed divine authority once literally cut the fingers off a corpse because of paperwork disputes. You couldn't script a better parody. Ordinary memory. And then there's the quieter, ordinary side of memory. For the people of Rome who actually witnessed it, the Cadaver Synod must have been a surreal trauma. Imagine standing in a church, listening to your Pope thunder at a body that stank of the grave. Imagine being the deacon forced to defend that body. Imagine going home and trying to explain to your family what you saw that day. We don't have those personal diaries, of course, but you can sense the unease in later records. Rome didn't forget. Even in a city used to violence, scandal, and political circus, this trial stood out as something uniquely disturbing. A strange kind of immortality. In the end, the Cadaver Synod gave Formosus a strange kind of immortality. His actual deeds as pope, crowning emperors, shuffling bishops, playing politics with nobles, those details are mostly forgotten. What survives is the image of him, dead and decaying, sitting silently in judgment while a living pope screamed at him. And maybe that's fitting. Formosus spent his life chasing power in a world where power was fleeting. In death, he achieved the one thing no other pope of his era managed: lasting fame. Not for holiness, not for reform, but for being the unwilling star of history's most macabre trial. Let's pause again, let the thought drift. The Cadaver Synod wasn't just a courtroom farce. It was a mirror, reflecting a papacy already hollowed out by factionalism. A corpse on a throne, a pope unraveling, a city recoiling, it's all too symbolic. In our next gentle wander, we'll slip into the wider 10th century, when the papacy stumbled into its so-called Dark Age, the Saeculum Obscurum, dominated by noble families, scandals, and short-lived popes. Because if you thought the corpse trial was peak absurdity, wait until you meet the Roman aristocrats who turned the papacy into their family business. So refill your cup, settle deeper, and let's drift into that next chapter of dysfunction. So, after the Cadaver Synod and the whiplash of guilty, innocent, guilty again verdicts, you might think the papacy would take a deep breath, learn from its mistakes, and try to restore some dignity. But this was 10th century Rome. Dignity was not on the menu. Instead, the papacy drifted into one of its darkest, and oddly most theatrical, periods. Historians call it the Saeculum Obscurum, or the Dark Age of the papacy. Later critics, with a little less subtlety, dubbed it the pornocracy. And no, That wasn't because popes were suddenly starring in anything risque. It was because Roman noblewomen, powerful, clever, and scandal-prone, ended up pulling the strings, with rumors swirling about affairs, illegitimate children, and political manipulation. It's basically the part of the story where the church stopped pretending to be about holiness and leaned fully into being a dynastic soap opera. Theodora and Marozia. At the heart of this period were two women, Theodora and her daughter Marozia, members of the powerful Theophylacti family. The Theophylacti controlled Rome the way you'd expect from any entrenched aristocratic clan, with land, money, and armed muscle. The papacy, to them, was simply another prize. Theodora was described by some chroniclers as senatrix of Rome, a kind of unofficial empress within the city. She was wealthy, politically savvy, and unafraid to place her allies in positions of power. Her daughter, Marozia, followed suit, and together they built a dynasty of influence that dominated papal politics for decades. Of course, medieval chroniclers, mostly men, mostly hostile, couldn't resist adding scandal to their descriptions. They accused Theodora and Marozia of seducing popes, installing lovers in office, and treating the papacy as their personal property. How much of that is true and how much is misogynistic gossip is hard to say. But the fact remains, the popes of the early 10th century were, more often than not, beholden to these women and their family. Sergius III, back to Formosus. One of the most infamous figures of this era was Pope Sergius III, who reigned from 904 to 911. Remember him? He was one of the judges at the Cadaver Synod years earlier, cheering on the spectacle of yelling at a corpse. When he finally got the papacy for himself, he brought back the verdict against Formosus and once again declared his ordinations invalid. By then, it was less about Formosus personally and more about keeping his faction permanently buried. But still, the poor man couldn't catch a break, even a decade after decomposition. Sergius was also rumored to have been Marozia's lover, and some chroniclers claim she bore him a son, who later became Pope John XI. Which, if true, would mean the papacy literally passed down through a pope's illegitimate child. You couldn't make this stuff up if you tried. A parade of short-lived popes. The decades after Sergius were a blur of short papacies, each one tangled in Roman factionalism. Some popes reigned for only months, others for a couple of years before being ousted or killed. It was less a line of succession and more a revolving door. Marozia herself eventually arranged the election of multiple popes, including her supposed son John XI. She wielded power openly, ruling Rome as a matriarch while popes came and went. Chroniclers, predictably, painted her as a corrupt seductress, though it's worth remembering that if she'd been a man, they probably would have just called her a clever statesman. Still, the image stuck. And so the term pornocracy was born, a period when Roman noblewomen were said to have run the papacy through influence, intrigue, and scandal. Symbol of decline. What's striking is how neatly the pornocracy followed on the heels of the Cadaver Synod. In both cases, the papacy was stripped of its dignity, reduced to a pawn in aristocratic games. First a corpse was dragged into court, then living popes were shuffled around like pieces in a family feud. Later centuries looked back on this period with a mix of horror and fascination. Protestant reformers again loved it, pointing to the pornocracy as proof of Rome's corruption. Catholic chroniclers, on the other hand, often tried to gloss over it, moving quickly to more respectable centuries. But the stories lingered. And in truth, there's something oddly human about it all. Behind the lofty titles and sacred rituals, the papacy was just as vulnerable to nepotism, vendettas, and dynastic ambition as any other throne in Europe. The difference was that everyone expected better, and what they got instead was a corpse on trial followed by a century of aristocratic drama. A pause in the candlelight. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine Rome in the early 900s. The Lateran Basilica still stands, its walls echoing with prayers. But outside, noble families jostle for power. Soldiers patrol the streets. Whispers spread about the Pope's loyalties, about who is really in charge, about whether the Bishop of Rome is holy or merely another pawn. The Cadaver Synod is still a fresh memory, its grotesque imagery a reminder of how far things can go. And now, new scandals bloom, affairs, illegitimate children, noble matriarchs pulling strings. For the ordinary Roman, it must have felt like the papacy was a stage play, acted out for the benefit of families who cared less about salvation and more about property lines. In our next gentle drift, we'll follow the papacy as it tries, haltingly, to claw its way back to stability. We'll see how later centuries tried to bury, sometimes literally, the memory of this bizarre period, and how the Cadaver Synod became less an event and more a cautionary tale told across generations. So take another sip, let the candlelight soften, and we'll wander into the quieter echoes of this story. By now, Rome had seen enough scandal to last several lifetimes. A corpse trial, papal stranglings, aristocratic matriarchs pulling strings. The papacy in the 9th and 10th centuries wasn't exactly radiating stability. But history has a way of stumbling forward, even through chaos. And so, slowly, painfully, the church began to patch itself together, stabilizing the chair. By the mid-10th century, the papacy was still under the thumb of Roman nobles, but new players began to intervene, the German emperors. Starting with Otto I in the mid-900s, the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire began asserting their authority over Rome. They saw themselves as protectors of the church, which really meant protectors of their own interests, but the result was at least a little more order. This didn't mean the papacy suddenly became holy and untouchable. Far from it. Popes were still deposed, manipulated, or imprisoned if they crossed the wrong faction. But the involvement of imperial power provided some guardrails. The endless carousel of short-lived popes slowed down, if only slightly. Of course, the memory of the Cadaver Synod lingered. Even centuries later, when people wanted to criticize the church, they pointed back to that moment as the nadir of papal authority. You could forgive corruption. You could excuse nepotism. But once you've put a corpse on trial, it's hard to live that one down. Medieval chroniclers. Medieval writers loved to retell the story, often with a sense of horrified fascination. Some treated it as proof that divine judgment always came. After all, Stephen VI was strangled not long after. Others used it as an example of human folly, a reminder of how far ambition could push even the holiest office. The Cadaver Synod also became a favorite tale in collections of strange and monstrous events. It was catalogued alongside eclipses, comets, and natural disasters. Things that shocked and unsettled the medieval imagination. If you wanted to scare your audience about the dangers of pride, you told them about the time Rome dragged a corpse into court. The long memory. By the Renaissance, the Cadaver Synod was practically a punchline. Humanist scholars, digging through old chronicles, shook their heads at the absurdity of it all. For writers like Platina, who compiled papal biographies in the 15th century, the corpse trial was the perfect example of how not to run the church. It wasn't just Catholic writers who remembered. Protestant reformers in the 16th century pounced on the story. To them, it was proof that the papacy had always been corrupt, always ridiculous. Martin Luther didn't need to invent new criticisms. He could simply point to Stephen VI screaming at a corpse and say, "See? This is what happens when you trust Rome." The story spread in pamphlets, sermons, and histories. It became a weapon in the religious wars of the early modern period, a convenient reminder that the Pope was not above absurdity. The lesson that stuck. What makes the Cadaver Synod so enduring is not just its strangeness but its symbolism. A dead man on trial was the perfect image of a papacy eaten alive by politics. It showed how fragile authority could be when torn between factions. And it proved that even institutions claiming divine guidance could descend into farce. Later generations didn't always agree on the moral. Was it a lesson about revenge? About corruption? About divine punishment? Or simply about human stupidity? The interpretations varied. But the memory stuck. The slow recovery. By the 11th century, the papacy began to rebuild its dignity more seriously. The Gregorian reform movement tried to free the church from aristocratic control, enforcing celibacy for clergy, cracking down on simony, and asserting papal independence. For a while, this gave the papacy a new sense of moral authority. But even then, the Cadaver Synod lurked in the background. Reformers could point to it as the nightmare scenario they were trying to prevent. It was the cautionary tale of what happened when the papacy became too entangled with local politics, too beholden to noble families. In that sense, Formosus's trial continued to shape policy long after his body had decomposed. A pause in the candlelight. Let's pause here. Imagine the Lateran Basilica again, but now a century later. The memory of the corpse trial is fading into legend, but whispers remain. Old men remember their fathers describing it. Priests remind their congregations of the folly of vengeance. Chroniclers tuck it into their manuscripts, half horrified, half amused. The corpse is long gone, dust in the ground. The men who condemned it are gone too. But the story still lingers, like a shadow cast across the papal throne. In our next gentle drift, we'll wander into the Renaissance and Reformation, when the Cadaver Synod was rediscovered, retold, and weaponized once again. Because if there's one thing history loves, it's a good scandal, and nothing says scandal quite like a pope yelling at a corpse. So stay cozy, let your tea or coffee cool, and we'll drift there next. By the time the Renaissance rolled around, the Cadaver Synod was already 500 years in the past. But like any good scandal, it refused to stay buried. Chroniclers and humanists digging through old manuscripts stumbled across the story and immediately realized they had struck gold. Because if there's one thing Renaissance scholars loved, it was finding proof that the ancients, or in this case, the medievals, were just as ridiculous as everyone suspected. Humanists side-eye. Take Bartolomeo Platina, for instance. Platina was a 15th century papal librarian and biographer, who produced one of the first comprehensive collections of papal lives. When he got to Stephen VI and the Cadaver Synod, he could barely hide his distaste. He described it as shameful, grotesque, and unworthy of the papacy. Which, honestly, is a polite way of saying, what on earth were these people thinking? Other humanists followed suit. For them, the Cadaver Synod was a kind of historical cautionary tale, a reminder that Rome's grandeur had been tarnished by centuries of mismanagement. It fit neatly into their worldview, the Middle Ages as a dark age, full of superstition and corruption, before the glorious light of the Renaissance returned. And what better symbol of darkness than a dead pope propped on a throne while another pope screamed at him? Reformation ammunition. Then came the 16th century, and with it, the Protestant Reformation. And if the Renaissance writers had shaken their heads at the Cadaver Synod, the reformers pounced on it like cats on a fallen slice of ham. For Martin Luther and his allies, the Cadaver Synod was Exhibit A in their case against Rome. Here was proof, they argued, that the papacy had always been corrupt, absurd, and unworthy of spiritual authority. If you wanted to convince a crowd that the Pope wasn't to be trusted, you didn't need a theological treatise. You just needed to tell them about the time Rome dragged a corpse into court and chopped off its fingers. Protestant pamphlets gleefully retold the story, often with exaggerated details. Some added grotesque illustrations, skeletal popes in robes, grim trials in shadowy basilicas. The Cadaver Synod became a kind of Protestant meme, passed around to ridicule the very idea that the papacy represented divine order. And, to be fair, Rome didn't have a great defense. Yes, we once put a corpse on trial, but we're much better now isn't exactly the strongest argument. Enlightenment satire. By the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers picked up the tale and gave it a fresh twist. Voltaire, always eager to mock the church, loved this kind of story. For him, the Cadaver Synod wasn't just a scandal of the past, it was proof that superstition and power made fools of even the most holy men. Imagine Voltaire, sipping one of his 50 cups of coffee a day in a Paris cafe, shaking his head and saying, "Ah yes, remember when they put a corpse on trial?" And people still think the church is the guardian of reason. For Enlightenment critics, the Cadaver Synod was tailor-made satire, the kind of absurdity that practically wrote itself. A morbid curiosity. Even outside of polemics, the Cadaver Synod fascinated people simply because it was so bizarre. Historians of the 17th and 18th centuries often included it in their works under the category of strange and monstrous events. Alongside comets, earthquakes, and plagues, you'd find 897 AD, the Pope tried a corpse. It had become less a political controversy and more a morbid curiosity, something to gawk at across the centuries. The medievals may have meant it seriously, but by the early modern period, it was remembered mostly as grotesque theatre. A pause for reflection. Let's pause again. Imagine being a listener in the 16th century, sitting in a crowded tavern, hearing a Protestant preacher retell the story of the Cadaver Synod. You laugh, you shake your head, you mutter that Rome has lost its mind. Or imagine being a Parisian philosopher in the 18th century, jotting it down in your notebook as the perfect example of why the Church cannot be trusted with reason. For centuries, the Cadaver Synod had been a real, immediate scandal in Rome. But by the Renaissance and beyond, it became something else, a weapon, a parable, a joke, depending on who told it. The corpse trial lived on not in bodies or bones but in words, repurposed for each new era. And in our next gentle drift, we'll follow it into the modern age. Because even today, the Cadaver Synod hasn't been forgotten. It pops up in books, podcasts, YouTube videos, and endless top 10 weirdest moments in history lists. We'll look at how modern historians interpret it, how popular culture retells it, and why we're still shaking our heads at a scandal more than 11 centuries old. So, take another sip, settle deeper under your blanket, and let's keep floating toward the quiet echo of this corpse trial in modern memory. By the time we reach the modern age, the Cadaver Synod has taken on a second life of its own. No longer just an obscure medieval scandal, but a story that keeps echoing through books, podcasts, classrooms, and endless strangest moments in history lists. Historians today tend to treat it with a mixture of disbelief and sober analysis, reminding us that yes, this really did happen, but also pointing out that it was not just a bizarre one-off. It was the visible eruption of a papacy tangled hopelessly in politics, a church throne reduced to the level of aristocratic squabbles, and a warning about what happens when grudges outweigh dignity. Still, it's hard not to smile a little grimly at the image of a pope, in full regalia, yelling at a rotting body slumped in papal robes. Popular culture, of course, has embraced the story with gusto. The Cadaver Synod pops up in documentaries, novels, and cartoons, always played for its grotesque absurdity. Internet listicles happily include it alongside oddities like dancing plagues and exploding trousers. You don't even need to embellish it. The bare facts are already stranger than fiction. And in that way, the Cadaver Synod has become something more than history. It's become a symbol, a shorthand for the moment when power, paranoia, and politics spiral so far that they trip into theater. Why does it stick with us? Perhaps because it's so vivid. Human memory latches onto the grotesque, and what could be more grotesque than a corpse on trial? Or perhaps because it strips away the mystique of authority and shows it for what it is, fragile, human, and often absurd. The papacy, which claimed eternal truth, was reduced to a shouting match with a corpse. And somehow, that image has outlived centuries of theological debate. It is the irony that makes it endure. Stephen VI wanted to erase Formosus from history. Instead, he guaranteed Formosus would never be forgotten. The Pope who dreamed of power, who crowned emperors and played politics like every other churchman of his age, is remembered not for those deeds but for sitting silently on trial long after his death. The Cadaver Synod is the ultimate example of unintended consequences. In trying to bury an enemy, you immortalize him instead. And so the story lingers, not in bones, not in decrees, but in memory, drifting quietly from century to century. Even now, more than 1100 years later, we still tell it. We sit in our quiet rooms, in the dim glow of screens, listening to the faint echo of candlelight on stone walls, hearing again the murmurs of a congregation as a pope shouts accusations into the void. It is history at its most absurd and at its most human. And if you've made it all the way here, still awake or drifting half asleep, you've now carried the memory with you too. The Cadaver Synod will continue to haunt us, not as a corpse in a basilica, but as a story of power undone by its own pettiness, a story of dignity collapsing into theatre, a story that proves that even the grandest titles cannot protect us from our own follies. So rest easy now, because the dead Pope has spoken all he can, and the living one who condemned him has long since fallen silent. The candles have burned down, the basilica is empty, and the strange trial is finally over, at least until the next time someone remembers it and shakes their head in disbelief.